convoy had been moving for 11 minutes when the first truck jackknifed. It wasn't an attack, just a pothole the size of a bathtub that the driver didn't see in time. Because the road through the Camino Industrial District hadn't been maintained in 3 months, and maintenance wasn't anyone's priority anymore. The truck swung sideways and caught the guardrail, and the vehicles behind it locked up in a chain reaction that left 40 meters of asphalt choked with steel and exhaust, and people who didn't know which way to run. The convoy was carrying civilians. 231 of them pulled from the Okamachi district shelter after the structural report came back red. Families with children. An elderly man with a dialysis machine in the back of the fourth vehicle. 3 volunteers from the relief agency who had been awake for 26 hours. They sat in the wreckage of their stopped vehicles and waited for someone to tell them what to do. The heroes assigned to this route were a 6-person team out of the Shinjuku satellite office, mid-tier professionals, licensed running their 4th evacuation detail this week. The woman leading the line had a wind-based quirk in hands that hadn't stopped shaking since the 3rd detail. Not from fear, from use. She'd been pushing air through collapsed corridors for 6 days straight. And her forearms had the kind of deep tremor that sleep didn't fix anymore. Her partner behind her had a scar across his chin from an evac 2 weeks ago, where they'd lost someone in the first 30 seconds. He didn't talk about it. He'd learned to scan rooftops before anything else. Their earpieces crackled with the coordination center, telling them to hold position, assess the situation, confirm the zone designation before initiating any civilian movement protocol. The woman looked at the jackknifed truck and then at the families climbing out of their vehicles and said into her comm, "We need to start moving people now." The coordinator said, "Confirmed assessment required before zone reclassification. Please hold." She looked at her partner. He looked at the sky. Then the sky answered. It came from the north, and it came fast, not the controlled descent of a flying hero, not the arc of a projectile. Something that had been moving at a speed the instruments in the area couldn't track, and had simply decided to stop. The deceleration happened in under a second. The shock wave hit the stopped convoy like a pressure wall, rocking vehicles on their frames, blowing out 2 windows in the nearest truck cab, knocking a relief volunteer flat onto the asphalt. Where the thing landed, the road was gone. A crater roughly 3 meters across and half a meter deep smoked at the edge of the industrial district's main thruway. Standing in it was a young man. He looked 17, maybe 18. Dark hair, pale skin, the kind of build that didn't match the face too much muscle for someone who still had the jaw of a teenager. He wore a suit that didn't belong to any hero agency anyone in the convoy had ever seen, dark paneling over something that absorbed light at the wrong angles, fitted close to the body with construction that looked less like fabric and more like armor that had learned to flex. The chest insignia was an S inside a pentagon, and the whole thing carried a low wrongness, like looking at a word you've read 1,000 times and suddenly being unable to parse it. He stood in the crater and surveyed the convoy. Not the people. The convoy. The trucks and the structure and the blocked road, and the 6 heroes with their comm devices already up. His head moved in a slow arc cataloging. Then someone screamed from the far end of the column. They came from the eastern access road, 30, maybe 40 of them. Escaped from Tartarus, still wearing shredded detention uniforms, moving with the velocity of people who had been locked in a concrete box for years and were now burning through every open space they could find. 3 of them had active quirks. The rest had numbers and the specific cruelty of men with nothing left to lose. The 6 hero team broke formation, immediately calling positions into their comms, while the coordinators started rapid-firing zone protocol updates that no one had time to absorb. The civilians scattered. Toward the trucks, away from the trucks, into the roadside ditch, into each other. A child separated from her mother in the crush of bodies. The elderly man with the dialysis machine tried to climb down from the truck bed and couldn't manage it. The 3 quirk-active convicts hit the hero line together. One hero went down hard, shoulder caved in by a force multiplication quirk that had already dropped 2 responders on a different site this week. Another caught a blast to the chest and skidded 30 meters down the asphalt before a crumpled fender stopped him. The remaining 4 held the line, but the numbers were wrong, and the ground was shrinking. The young man in the crater watched all of it. He watched a convict seize a teenage girl by the arm. He watched a hero absorb a hit that would leave the arm useless for weeks. He watched the coordinator's voice loop in everyone's ear. Maintain perimeter, while the perimeter actively came apart at every seam. He stepped out of the crater. He didn't run. He walked, and the distance between him and the nearest convict collapsed, regardless, because each step covered ground that didn't correspond to the space his body should have crossed. The first convict turned and activated his quirk, a crackling electrical discharge that had dropped 2 heroes already tonight. It hit the young man full in the chest and accomplished nothing. Less than nothing. The young man glanced down at the scorch mark, then back up at the convict with an expression that held no anger, no alarm. Something closer to mild offense, like being handed a broken tool. He grabbed the convict by the collar, lifted him off the ground, and deposited him on his back in the roadside ditch. Not thrown, placed, the way you'd move a chair out of a doorway. The second convict swung a reinforced pipe from behind. The pipe bent around his skull without leaving a mark. He turned, stripped the pipe away, dropped it. The third, still dragging the teenage girl, made it 10 steps before the young man appeared in front of him, without anyone witnessing the transit. He didn't speak. He looked at the convict's grip on the girl's arm, and the convict let go. Then he was moving through the rest of them, and the confrontation stopped being a confrontation. It became a process. Unhurried, methodical, final. Convicts with quirks learned what it felt like to have those quirks connect with something that registered no damage and returned no ground. The ones without quirks lasted seconds. The ones with them lasted the same amount of time and came away with much less dignity. 43 seconds after he stepped out of the crater, no one on that road was standing except the heroes. The woman with the wind quirk had her hands raised for a gust that she'd never thrown. She lowered them slowly.
Jata.
He didn't stop at the convicts. While the heroes were still recalibrating, while the coordination center filled every earpiece with status requests, nobody answered. The young man moved through the wreckage and started extracting people. Not gently, efficiently. A crumpled door got peeled back. A woman pinned under a panel came free with one hand underneath her. The elderly man with the dialysis machine got lowered from the truck bed with a care that said whoever was doing this understood the equipment and where not to apply pressure. The child who had separated from her mother got found 2 minutes into the chaos and returned without comment. He worked through the wreck like the disaster was a problem set, not a catastrophe to be triaged. And the gap between those two things was stark and immediate. People who had been bleeding on the ground, waiting for extraction, stopped waiting. The 6 heroes, once they understood the rhythm he'd established, divided themselves between securing the downed convicts and catching up to the pace he'd set. It was the wind quirk woman who first registered that the comm traffic had changed character. The coordinator wanted to know who the unregistered individual was. Then a second voice joined, then a third. Then someone higher up the chain instructed the ground team to identify the subject and formally request he stand down from unauthorized intervention. There was a brief side discussion, she caught fragments of it, about liability exposure and documentation and whether the incident fell under the emergency action clause or required a separate filing. She looked at what the young man was doing. She looked at her earpiece. She didn't answer. He heard all of it. The comm channels reached him as clearly as a conversation in the same room. He heard the zone designation argument. He heard someone calculate whether his actions created commission liability. He heard the phrase, unauthorized actor used to describe him, and then a separate voice use liability event to describe the convoy itself. The 231 people currently sitting on the roadside in emergency blankets. He heard the drone commercial news feed, not emergency services, lock onto his position and begin a live transmission. He set a 7-year-old boy on his feet, checked that the ankle held weight, and watched him run back to his mother. Then he straightened and turned toward the 6 heroes forming a loose perimeter around him. The windquirk woman came forward first. She moved like someone accustomed to hard conversations and committed to having them anyway. She stopped 3 meters out. "You're not registered," she said. "No. We have coordination protocols for situations like this. You've been operating outside them." He looked past her at the convoy, the people on the roadside, the secured convicts, the drone holding position 40 meters overhead with its camera angled directly at him. Then at the coordination vehicle parked 50 meters back, its logo printed large on the side panel. Clean design, high contrast. The kind of branding that read well in photographs. He'd seen this before. Not this world, not this version, but this shape, the logo, the protocol, the camera, the machine that turned rescue into content, and called it heroism. "Your protocol told you to hold position," he said, while those people were being dragged into a ditch. She didn't have a fast answer. She was working the angles, finding language that could acknowledge what happened without surrendering the frame. He didn't wait for it. "You even branded the vehicle," he said. "It wasn't loud. It landed anyway. You put a logo on the rescue operation." The words weren't directed at her specifically. She understood that. He was saying it to the drone, to the earpiece, to whatever was on the other end of those comm channels, still asking for documentation. Something in his expression shifted, not toward rage, toward verdict. "Tell whoever's asking," he said quietly, "that I know exactly what kind of world this is." The windquirk woman held his gaze as he turned and studied the full length of the wrecked convoy corridor, the people alive on the roadside. The infrastructure of an operation that had required 11 minutes of protocol and 43 seconds of actual intervention to resolve. And the look on his face was not something she would be able to put into a report. It wasn't contempt, not exactly, not. It was the expression of someone who had suspected the answer before they walked in, asked the question anyway, and received a response that was somehow still worse than expected. The drone kept transmitting. The coordinator kept requesting status. Somewhere in the city, alerts propagated through the commission's alert tree: unregistered individual quirk classification, unknown intervention site, Camino District Thruway. He stood in the middle of it and let it all run. Then he looked north toward the city proper, toward the towers and the emergency lights, and the slow churn of a metropolitan area that was failing one district at a time. And what crossed his face in that moment was not the conclusion he'd just reached about this road. It was the beginning of a much larger one. The footage reached the Commission's crisis desk at 11:47 p.m. By midnight, 3 separate feeds were running the commercial drone from Camino, a traffic monitoring relay that had caught the shockwave on its seismic sensor, and a civilian phone recording uploaded from 4 blocks away, showing the crater impact from street level. The quality on the last one was poor. The content was not. Director Okonkwo watched all 3 simultaneously on the display wall of the Emergency Operations Center and said nothing for a long moment. Around her, the room moved. Analysts cross-referencing quirk signatures against every registered and flagged profile in the national database. Coordinators managing the 17 active evacuation corridors still running across Greater Tokyo. a liaison on a secure channel to the Public Safety Bureau, trying to explain why a Zone 3 alert had just reclassified itself without authorization. "Strength classification," she said finally. "Undetermined. Impact force on crater formation is off the high end of our Class S scale. We'd need a controlled measurement." "We're not getting a controlled measurement." She studied the Camino feed, the figure still standing at the convoy wreck site, while the local hero team gave him a wide perimeter. "Threat assessment? Unknown intent. No attack on civilians, no attack on heroes. 231 successful extractions in under 8 minutes. The analyst paused. "He's faster and stronger than anything we have a file on. But he hasn't hurt anyone who wasn't trying to hurt someone else." "Yet," said a voice from the doorway. Hawks walked in without being announced, hands in his jacket pockets, moving like someone who had already decided where he was going to sit before he entered the room. He glanced at the feeds, then at the director. "You're going to send me," he said. It wasn't a question. "We need a read on him. You're the best at that." "I know." He studied the Camino footage for a moment, the figure standing still, while everything around him continued to process the disaster he'd resolved in under a minute. What's the containment play if he decides to stop cooperating? The director kept her eyes on the screen. Best Genist is already positioned 2 kilometers east. Endeavor is inbound from the Saitama incident ETA 11 minutes. That's not an answer. "No," she said. "It isn't." Hawks nodded slowly. He understood what she wasn't saying. The Commission was good at managing heroes and managing crises and managing public perception of the intersection between the two. It was not built for the possibility that something might arrive that sat completely outside the framework those 3 functions created. "I'll go talk to him," he said. "Keep Endeavor on standby. Don't scramble anyone else unless I go quiet." He was already heading for the door. "Hawks." The director's voice stopped him. "The media has the Camino footage. All of it." He paused with his hand on the frame. "How long before it's everywhere?" "It's already everywhere." He left. The city didn't sleep, but it had gotten quieter over the past months in the particular way of places that have learned to conserve energy. Fewer lights, fewer people on open streets after dark. The businesses that remained open did so with the grim efficiency of institutions that had already decided they would outlast the current crisis and were simply waiting for it to end. Prime stood on the elevated walkway above the Camino district and watched the city the way a person watches a machine they're trying to understand. He'd been listening since the convoy, not to any single channel to all of them layered the way a place this size produced. Sound the emergency broadcast frequencies, the hero agency coordination nets, the commercial media feeds the background static of a metropolitan infrastructure running on reduced capacity. He assembled the shape of it, the way you'd assemble a map from fragments, adding each piece to a picture that kept confirming the same thing. He'd seen this shape before. Different scale, different names on the buildings, different logos on the vehicles, same architecture underneath. A society that had decided the performance of safety was close enough to safety that the distinction stopped mattering. The heroes assigned to his current position. 3 of them maintaining careful distance on the walkway's far end were watching him with professional wariness. Competent, tired. Working their 6th or 7th shift this week by the look of them. They were real. That was never the question. He heard the wings before he saw them. Hawks came in low and easy, folding his red feathers back as he landed on the walkway railing about 8 meters out, close enough to talk, far enough to move. He settled there with a casualness that was doing considerable invisible work. Sharp eyes tracked across the figure in front of him. The suit, the build, The stillness, the specific quality of attention that most people wore as watchfulness, and this one carried as something closer to verdict in progress. He'd dealt with powerful people before. Powerful people usually wanted something from you the moment you showed up. A reaction, a concession, a position to push against. This one was watching him land like he was logging another data point. "Long night," Hawks said. No response. 231 people made it out of Camino because of you. He kept his tone easy, the register he used when he needed someone to hear him rather than react to him. "That's not nothing." "It took 43 seconds, the young man said. "The protocol had been running for 11 minutes before I arrived." "Yeah." Hawks didn't argue that. The protocols aren't built for speed. They're built for not making things worse. They told a hero to hold position while a girl was being dragged into a ditch. They told a hero to hold position so that 12 other heroes working the corridor further down the route didn't lose their civilian count because one team broke formation. Context is complicated. The young man's face said he understood exactly what Hawks was doing and found it about as impressive as the electrical discharge at Camino. "You're very good at this," he said. Hawks tilted his head. "At what?" "Making the machine sound reasonable. A beat." Hawks kept his posture easy, his hands visible, his weight settled. Behind him, he knew Genist's position was locked 2 kilometers east. He knew Endeavor was 8 minutes out. He knew 3 hero teams had quietly repositioned to the walkway's ground-level access points. Buying time. The young man knew it too. Neither of them pretended otherwise. "What's your name?" Hawks asked. "It doesn't matter here." "Humor me." "Prime," the young man said flat, a designation rather than an identity, and Hawks filed that away. "Okay, Prime." He shifted his weight on the railing. "I've been doing this long enough to know when I'm talking to someone who's made a decision and when I'm talking to someone still making one." "Which is this?" Prime held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked past him at the city. "Tell me something. The heroes you have positioned right now, ground level 2 kilometers east, the fire user coming in from the north, do they do this because they want to, or because they were authorized to?" Hawks didn't answer immediately. Any version of the truth he offered was going to land in Prime's framing and stay there. "Both," he said finally. "For most of them, both. And when those two things conflict, usually the authorization wins." Hawks held his gaze. "That's how systems work." "That," Prime said, "is the problem." He wasn't angry when he said it. That was the detail that stayed with Hawks afterward through everything that followed. Most people with a grievance against the system came at it with heat, bitterness, indignation, the raw edge of someone who felt cheated. This was different. This was a man reading a structural flaw out loud. Certain flat and completely without expectation that the structure would care. "Your top hero for the last 20 years, Prime said, was a man who smiled for cameras while his body was rotting." His voice didn't shift. "Your commission classified him as a symbol and scheduled his appearances accordingly. The smiling was the product. The man behind it was overhead." He paused. A short, ugly pause. "I've seen that trade before. Different uniform, same math." Hawks kept his face neutral. He was extremely good at that. "And the people he saved," he said, "were they part of the math?" "No." Something moved across Prime's face, not softening, not sympathy. Recognition, cold and specific, like identifying a recurring error. The people he saved were the only honest thing in the operation. That's always how it works. Real people doing real things buried inside a structure that found them, dressed them up, and built a revenue model on top. His jaw tightened just slightly, just enough to show it was personal in a way he hadn't decided to explain. And then, the revenue model starts to matter more than the people. And the people start to serve the model. And eventually, you get a rescue team holding position because the zone paperwork isn't cleared. He was looking at the city again. You licensed salvation, he said. You turned protecting people into a jurisdiction, something you grant, something you can revoke. The words weren't loud. They landed anyway. I watched someone almost die tonight, waiting for authorization to be rescued. Hawks was quiet for a moment. He couldn't tell Prime he was wrong about everything because he wasn't. And lying to this particular person felt like bringing a penknife to a structural argument. You're describing the worst version of a system that does a lot of real good, he said carefully. I'm describing the version running on this road for 11 minutes before I arrived. Silence. In his earpiece, Endeavor is 4 minutes out. Best Genist confirms position. On your call. Hawks looked at the young man in front of him. The S insignia. The stillness. The way he held himself like the outcome of this conversation had been settled before it started, and he was simply allowing Hawks time to catch up. What do you want? Hawks asked. Straight. No operator packaging. For this world. Prime looked at him. Nothing it can give me. Hawks unfolded from the railing. Zones. The feathers came first, not an attack, a calibration. 40 red veins scattered across the walkway in a web moving to map reaction time and force a spatial response. Prime walked through them, not around through each feather, stopping dead against his suit while he continued at a pace that didn't match the movement of his legs. Hawks was already airborne, banking wide for high ground. His remaining feathers consolidated into a driving wedge, aimed to redirect Prime toward the railing and off the walkway away from the civilian sectors 2 blocks south. Not damage. Geometry. Prime glanced up. The wedge connected and came apart, feathers scattering like they'd hit a load-bearing column. He tracked Hawks in the air with the same expression as before, now carrying one new variable. Below the ground, teams moved. Best Genist arrived from the east without announcement. Carbon fiber threads were already spreading across the walkway's structural supports before he landed, not a cage, exactly more like a tailor measuring a room before cutting it apart. Each thread placement was deliberate, reading the space, closing off angles. He worked the geometry of the walkway the way someone works a difficult fabric, find the load points, control the tension, and the shape follows. Against anything in the National Threat Register, the configuration would have held. Prime reached out and pulled. The entire web came toward him, like the anchor end of a rope, 40-ton rated carbon fiber going taut and then releasing as the attachment points gave way in sequence. He dropped the mass over the railing into the street below without looking. Best Genist watched the threads fall. He began a second configuration immediately, this time targeting the walkway surface itself, altering the terrain, cutting the available ground into smaller and smaller sections. Then Endeavor came down. He descended from the north at an angle that put the city behind him, and the hell-flame column he drove into the walkway surface was not a warning. It was a statement. Hot enough and concentrated enough that anything occupying that space either vacated it or became part of the structural damage. The walkway center went white. Prime stood in it. Endeavor held the output, pushing temperature past the threshold, where quirk-resistant composites began to lose integrity. His jaw set, eyes cutting through the heat distortion, looking for any response, any movement, any indication of a ceiling. Prime walked out from the far side. One shoulder panel on his suit showed black scoring. His face had changed not into fury, but into something colder and more deliberate. The expression of someone who had anticipated this exact moment in this exact form. and had been carrying the weight of that anticipation for longer than anyone here understood. "You're real," he said to Endeavor. The words came stripped of anything extra. "The fire is real. The choice to be standing here is real." Endeavor said nothing. His hands were already reshaping for a second strike. "That's what makes this worse," Prime said. He covered the distance between them in a fraction of a second. The impact registered on seismic equipment 2 kilometers away. Endeavor took the strike across the chest and traveled through the walkway railing, through open air, through the facade of the commercial building on the far side of the street, through 2 interior walls, and into the structural support of the second floor before momentum gave out. The building registered the arrival with a full-body groan. Emergency strips activated on the lower floors. A cascade of ceiling material came down in sheets. On the street below, one of the ground-level hero teams went completely silent on comms. Not a technical failure. They'd seen Number 1 get driven through a building like a bolt through particle board, and the silence was the sound of a professional calibration breaking. Endeavor pushed out of the rubble under his own power. Chest plate deformed across the sternum. Ribs 3, possibly 4. The hell flame read his blood chemistry and compensated, stoking his core temperature to keep his body in combat range. He'd been hit before. He'd been hit by things that were technically in this force category. But those impacts had always carried something else, a quirk signature, an energy transfer, some secondary effect he could analyze and factor. This one had been nothing but mass and velocity, and the complete absence of any upper limit he could identify. He stood in the rubble and processed that. Across the street, Hawks landed on the broken walkway beside Best Jeanist and studied the hole in the building's facade, the clean geometry of it, impact entry to load-bearing arrest, a straight line through everything the building had. 4 minutes, Best Jeanist said. His voice carried the same precision it always did. His eyes were already recalculating thread geometry for the altered terrain. "Yeah," Hawk said. The civilian sectors 2 blocks south were clear. The evacuation corridors had been moving people since before Camino. That was the only reason this block could absorb what just happened without compounding into something unmanageable. Prime stood on the walkway and did not pursue. He turned toward Hawks and Best Jeanist with the same systematic attention he'd given everything else since landing, the featherwork still spinning its standby tension in Hawks's grip, the fresh threads forming at Best Jeanist's fingers, the 2 of them positioned correctly and braced and waiting. "I'm not going to tell you they fought badly," Prime said. "They didn't." Neither hero answered. "That's the point." He looked north toward the denser corridors where the emergency lighting ran brightest. "You built the best version of this that this kind of structure can produce. It still runs on the same logic. Flat. Certain. That's not a performance problem. That's a design problem." He rose off the walkway, not a dramatic ascent, just an application of force and a change in altitude, and moved north toward the city proper, where more evacuation routes and more coordination channels and more branded vehicles were running their various operations into the small hours. In his earpiece, Hawks heard the Commission's emergency channel shift register. Still running. Still voices and traffic and the machinery of the system cycling through its protocols. But underneath the operational noise, something had gone very still. The specific stillness of people who had just watched their best tools deployed correctly and come back wrong and were not yet saying out loud what that meant. Somewhere in the network, he knew a different kind of call was being placed. Endeavor came out of the building under his own power, trailing low-smoke hell flame, burning at reduced output. He looked up at the sky where Prime had gone. His face held none of the things people expected from him after a losing engagement. No visible rage, no wounded pride working itself back into aggression. What was there instead was quieter and considerably harder to look at directly. He looked like a man confirming something he had already known was coming, and had spent years constructing reasons to doubt. He held his eyes on the empty sky for a moment. Then he looked at Hawks. "Get All Might," he said. Nobody called him. That was the thing Hawks kept coming back to later when he was giving his incident report and trying to reconstruct the sequence of events with the precision the commission required. Nobody had called Toshinori Yagi. The alert had gone out through standard channels. The threat classification had been updated, and somewhere in the network of contacts and notifications that surrounded the former #1 hero, the information had simply found him. He'd shown up on his own. Hawks had been 30 meters off the ground when he spotted the figure on the street below, tall, thin, in the way that spoke of a body that had spent everything it had on something bigger than itself, moving with a deliberateness that wasn't quite the walk of a frail man, and wasn't quite the walk of a hero anymore. Just a man who had decided to go somewhere and was going there. He was wearing civilian clothes. No armor, no suit, just the gaunt frame and the specific quality of presence that had once made children stop crying in disaster zones because they recognized the silhouette. "Sir Bucks," Hawks said, dropping altitude. "You shouldn't be." "I know," Toshinori said. He didn't stop walking. Hawks fell in beside him. "He put Endeavor through a building." "I heard. The structural damage alone." "Hawks," he said it gently without breaking stride. "I'm not going to stop you from flying cover, but I'm going." Hawks looked at the sky ahead where the emergency lighting ran thick, and the comm channels were still logging Prime's northward track through the city. He thought about saying several things. He didn't say any of them. He flew. Prime had stopped on the roof of a transit hub, 2 kilometers north of the walkway. Engagement not because anything had slowed him down, but because there was something worth stopping for. The city spread out below him in a grid of half-lit corridors and emergency response vectors, rescue teams, routing around structural failures, coordination signals bouncing between the Commission's surviving relay nodes. He'd been mapping it since Camino. By now, he had a complete picture of how the machine was organized, where its load-bearing points were, which nodes would cause cascading failures, if removed. He wasn't ready to move on that yet. He was still deciding something. The decision was about All Might. He'd known the name before he'd understood the world, known it the way you know a shape from a distance before you can read the details. Symbol of peace, retirement, transfer of power. The Commission's anchor asset for 2 decades, now unavailable for direct deployment, managed instead as a cultural institution. There were entire departments whose function was the maintenance of All Might's legacy as a stabilizing force on public confidence. That was one layer. The other layer was what he'd picked up in the residual signals, the things not managed, and not press release the number of people the man had personally extracted from impossible situations. The documented cases of civilians who had described the experience of seeing All Might appear as the specific sensation of believing survival was possible again. The way entire incident sites had shifted emotional register the moment he arrived. Not because of his strength, but because of what his presence meant to people who were running out of reasons to hold on. That was something different. Prime stayed on the roof and waited because he understood that All Might was coming and that this was a conversation that needed to happen before anything else. Toshinori found him by the simple method of walking toward the highest concentration of emergency lights and following the path the Commission's response network had cleared. The teams on the ground gave him room without being asked. One young hero couldn't have been more than 22, started to say something and stopped. And Toshinori recognized the expression, the one people wore when they wanted to tell him he shouldn't be here, and couldn't quite form the words because some part of them was also deeply relieved that he was. He stepped onto the roof access and came out into the open air. Prime was standing at the far edge, looking north. He turned when Toshinori appeared, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The wind ran between them. Below the city continued its managed deterioration sirens. In the middle distance, the chop of a commissioned helicopter, making a sweep, the low-grade hum of a metropolitan area running on backup systems and diminished expectations. Prime studied him the way he'd studied everything since Camino. Cataloging, adding to the picture, but there was something different in it this time. A slight pause in the process, the way an assessment slows when it encounters data that doesn't fit the existing model. Toshinori looked back steadily. He'd faced things in his career that could have killed him 100 different ways. He'd learned to read the difference between the kind of dangerous that wanted to destroy and the kind that wanted to be understood. This was the second kind. That didn't make it less dangerous. It made it considerably more complicated. "You came alone," Prime said. "Yes. Without armor. Without your power. What I have left of it." Toshinori's voice was even. "Enough to be here." Prime held him in that assessment for another moment. Then something in the quality of his attention shifted, not lessening, but changing character. The cataloging stopped. Whatever he'd been adding to the picture was now complete. "You're the real thing," he said. The words came without inflection, the tone of someone stating a confirmed observation. "I've been walking through this city for hours. The protocol, the licensing, the coordination vehicles with their logos, the media positioning." He paused. "And then there's you." Toshinori didn't answer immediately. He was listening to the way the words were arranged, not an accusation, not an opening move, an accounting. "I've made my share of mistakes," he said finally. "This system has made a great many more. I'm not going to stand here and tell you otherwise." "I know you won't." Prime's head tilted slightly. "That's part of what I mean." The city moved below them. Hawks held position at altitude far enough back to give the conversation space close enough to see both figures clearly. In his earpiece, the commission was very carefully not issuing orders. Director Okonkwo had been on the channel for the last 4 minutes and hadn't said a word. "They built everything on your back," Prime said. "Not on what you were, on what you represented." His voice was level, carrying the particular flatness of someone who has stopped being surprised by the thing they're describing. "They didn't teach people how to protect others. They taught people that protection was something that came from symbols like you. And when you were gone, they had a symbol-shaped hole and nothing underneath it." Toshinori was quiet for a moment. "That may be true," he said. "Parts of it certainly are." "Then you agree the structure is rotten?" "I agree," Toshinori said carefully, "that the structure has real failures, serious ones. That it has sometimes protected its own continuation more than it's protected the people it was built to serve." He held Prime's gaze. "I don't agree that the people inside it stopped deserving protection because of that. The people inside it are being failed by it. Yes, which is why they still need protection." Something in Toshinori's bearing shifted, not more aggressive, but more grounded, like a tree pressing its roots deeper before a wind. A flawed world doesn't become worth less. The people in it don't become worth less. They become worth more protection, not less. Prime looked at him. Something moved across his face that wasn't the flat kinking of contempt he'd worn through the rest of the city. It was harder to read than that. "You actually believe that?" he said. "Yes, meant. Even after everything this system did to the word that you built your life around." The pause that followed was very short, but it was real. "Especially then," Toshinori said. Below, a section of the transit hub's eastern facade was being shored up by a hero team. The work was competent and underfunded and slightly behind schedule, the way everything in the city was slightly behind schedule now. Two civilians were watching from across the street, an older woman and a teenager. Neither of them moving, both of them looking at the roof where the two figures stood. Prime turned his head and saw them. He looked at them for 2 seconds. Then he looked back at Toshinori. "I'm not going to tell you I don't understand what you're saying," he said. "I understand it exactly." He took one step forward, not aggressive, not positioning, just closing distance the way you close distance before saying something that requires proximity to carry its full weight. That's why I'm telling you it isn't enough. Understanding why people deserve protection doesn't change what this world built around the concept. The system is the problem. The system doesn't get fixed by the people inside it being real. Then what does it get fixed by? Prime said nothing. After a moment, Toshinori exhaled slowly. "I thought so," he said. He stepped toward Prime, and the movement was deliberate enough that everyone watching Hawks at altitude, the teams on the ground, the two civilians across the street, the commission cameras that had locked onto the rooftop, understood that whatever came next was a choice, not a stumble. Matitained. Prime didn't move immediately. He waited until Toshinori had crossed half the distance between them, watching the approach. The commitment in it, the specific quality of someone who has run out of options and selected the one that costs the most. Then he moved. The exchange was brief. Toshinori had trained for 5 decades under pressures that would have ended most professional careers in the first year. He had reflexes built through situations that no formal curriculum covered. And he had whatever fraction of one for all still lived in the cellular memory of his body, even after the transfer. It was not nothing. It was also not close. Prime's first strike he partially deflected, redirecting the impact angle enough to stay upright. His counter landed and connected. Prime registered it, the way a wall registers a hammer absorbing, rather than yielding, not bothering to move. Toshinori drove through it, pressing, using the 2 seconds of contact time to do the only thing that mattered, hold Prime's attention in one place, while the evacuation teams 3 blocks south finished their final corridor sweep. He'd timed it. He'd known what he was buying, and he'd calculated the cost before he stepped onto the roof. Prime caught him on the 3rd exchange. The force was measured, not the full application that had moved Endeavor through 2 walls, but enough calibrated to distance and trajectory and the specific engineering of this particular roof on this particular building and what was below it. Toshinori left the surface, cleared the rooftop edge, and the arc carried him across the open air above the street and into the upper face of the commercial building opposite. The impact was visible from 4 blocks in every direction. The civilian woman across the street made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The teenager beside her grabbed her arm. On the commission channel, someone drew a breath and didn't release it for several seconds. Hawks was already moving, angling down to close the gap. But he'd seen the trajectory, and he knew before he arrived that Toshinori had survived it. The angle was survivable. The building face had given enough. Injured, grounded, out of the engagement, still breathing. And then Prime stood at the roof edge and looked at the hole in the building across the street. The city held its breath around him, not silence, because the city had stopped being truly silent weeks ago, but a different quality of noise. The coordination chatter on the open channels had dropped to a murmur. The teams on the ground had stopped their lateral repositioning and gone still. Even the helicopter made a wide turn and held its distance. He looked at the building for a long moment. Then he looked down at the 2 civilians still standing across the street. The woman and the teenager, neither of them having run. The teenager was holding the woman's arm. Both of them were looking at the building where All Might had gone in, and then at Prime, and then back at the building in the way people look when they are trying to make sense of something that sits outside their existing categories. He understood that look. He'd seen it before in other places, on other faces. The moment when a world that had told itself one story about how things worked encountered direct evidence that the story had a gap in it. He turned away from the edge. The city was north of him, spreading out in its grid of failing infrastructure and ongoing human effort. He knew where the Commission's main coordination hub was. He knew the load-bearing nodes. He knew the path. But he paused, and the pause was because of something in the corner of his awareness that hadn't been there an hour ago. A signal thread that had just reoriented a presence moving fast through the southern grid, not on any coordination channel, moving in the way things moved when they weren't waiting for authorization. Moving toward him. He recognized the pattern. He'd been watching the city long enough to know its rhythms, and this wasn't the rhythm of a professional hero team repositioning to a new threat vector. This was one person, young, moving with the reckless geometric efficiency of someone who had made a decision and was now in the execution phase with nothing held back. He looked south. He waited. The comm channel Izuku was patched into went strange at 2:14 a.m. Not silent, the opposite. Too many voices at once layered over each other in the way channels sounded when the people on them had stopped following protocol and started just talking, which only happened when something had broken the part of their training that kept them disciplined under pressure. He caught fragments confirmed down repeat. All might is down, visual confirmation, building impact eastern face we need. And then the voices started stepping on each other, and he stopped trying to parse individual words and just ran faster. He'd been 3 kilometers south when the alert came through. He was closing that gap now at the kind of speed that turned the city into a blur of streetlight and shadow. His body running the calculations. Automatically weight distribution, surface friction, the specific geometry of the elevated rail he'd just used to cut 200 meters off his route. While his mind was doing something else entirely. He was thinking about the footage from Camino. He'd watched it 4 times on a cracked screen in a temporary shelter before anyone knew he was gone. The convoy wreck, the 43 seconds the aftermath. Then the walkway engagement hawks deploying and regrouping best genists, threads, coming apart like thread pulled from cheap fabric Endeavor's column of fire occupying the space. Where something should have stopped and didn't. Then, the rooftop. He hadn't been able to get a clear visual on the rooftop exchange, but he'd heard the impact 2 seconds after it registered on the seismic feed. And he'd understood what the sound meant. He came over the last elevated section and saw it. The building facade cracked and dusted. The hole in the upper floor. And on the street below, 3 heroes from a ground team doing what they could while a 4th was on his phone. And from the way his hand was shaking, it was not a good call to be on. Izuku landed, absorbed the impact through his legs, and was moving again before the dust settled. "Where is he?" he said to the nearest hero, a tall woman with a capture wire quirk coiled and useless at her side. She looked at him. Then she looked north. "Rooftop. Transit hub 2 blocks." Her voice had the flat effect of someone managing shock. "He's just standing there, waiting." Izuku looked north, looked at the hole in the building, looked at the evacuation corridor on his left, where a group of civilians had stopped moving and were standing in the street staring at the damage. The way people stood when the thing that had told them the world made sense had just been visibly contradicted. "Get those people moving," he said. Then he ran north. Prime heard him coming the same way he'd heard the wings on the walkway. Not a surprise, a confirmation. The signal he'd tracked from the rooftop had been resolving into a clearer picture over the last 90 seconds, and what it resolved into was this young, fast-moving on a direct intercept line, without any of the lateral repositioning that characterized trained hero deployment. No flanking, no support coordination, just straight toward him at full output. Which either meant the person coming was reckless or had made a very specific calculation about what mattered more than their own approach angle. He watched the figure clear the last building corner and land on the transit hub's lower roof in a single vault that covered too much distance for the takeoff point to be physically reasonable. Green, dark hair. The costume was worn in the way things got worn, when they'd been through real use rather than just simulated stress. The fabric had patches over patches. The support items showed replacement components that didn't quite match the originals. He moved like someone who had spent a long time learning to make a body do things bodies weren't supposed to do and had gotten good enough at it that the unnaturalness had become its own kind of fluency. Prime stood at the roof edge and waited. Izuku came up over the last level, landed 8 meters out, and stopped. For a moment, they looked at each other across the rooftop. Below, the city was still processing what had happened. The comm chatter, the repositioning teams, the civilians who hadn't moved far enough yet. The hole in the building 2 blocks south was visible from here. "I need you to come with me," Izuku said. His breathing was elevated but controlled, away from the residential zones. Prime said nothing. "North of here, there's a decommissioned industrial corridor. Elevated rail, empty structures. No civilians." Izuku's gaze was direct, not challenging, the way you looked at something dangerous when you'd already decided you weren't going to pretend it wasn't there. "I'm asking you to move the fight there." "You're asking," Prime said. "Yeah. You're not going to tell me I have to. You're not positioning to force it." "I couldn't force it," Izuku said. "You know that. I know that." A beat. "But you're still here, which means you haven't decided everything yet. So I'm asking." Prime looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped off the roof edge, rose to altitude, and moved north. Izuku followed. The industrial corridor was 3 minutes at pace, a stretch of the old outer ring manufacturing zone that had been partially condemned after the Liberation War structures still standing, but emptied the kind of urban negative space that cities accumulated when they expanded faster than they could maintain. Elevated rail lines ran through it at 2 levels. The floor of the corridor was broken concrete and rebar, and the skeletal remains of loading infrastructure. Prime landed in the center of it and turned. Izuku came down 40 meters out, already reading the space, the rail lines as high ground, and movement options, the structural columns as cover, that would be cover for exactly 1 hit before they stopped being. Standing the open lanes between the old loading bays as the lines Prime would try to use to corner him. He made the calculations in under 2 seconds and started moving before Prime had fully settled. The first exchange was a probe Izuku, driving in at an angle that put a structural column between them and forced Prime to track laterally, then breaking off before the return. He wasn't trying to land anything. He was trying to learn the space through Prime's movements, the way Prime turned the arc his attention followed, the way a river learns the shape of stone. Prime let him run 2 circuits before he stopped tolerating it. He moved, and the gap collapsed. Izuku went airborne off a rail strut, caught the angle, drove his full output into a blow that connected with Prime's shoulder, and rang up his arm like he'd hit structural steel at speed. Prime didn't move. Not absorbed, didn't move. Izuku was already off the contact point, redirecting using the rebound to carry him toward the second rail line before the counterattack arrived. It arrived anyway. Prime's strike caught him on the redirect midair, no solid surface to brace from. The force translated through his suit's impact distribution and kept going, and he hit the far wall of an old loading bay at a speed that turned the corrugated metal into a sound like a gunshot. He came through the other side in a shower of rust and landed hard on broken concrete. Up. He was up before the debris finished falling. He came back at a different angle, lower cutting under Prime's sightline. And this time he aimed for the legs, not to damage, to disrupt footing, to create a half-second of recalibration. It worked in the technical sense. Prime's weight shifted, his trajectory adjusted. What it didn't do was give Izuku the time he'd calculated on. The recalibration took 1/10 of the second he'd anticipated, which said something about the processing speed of whatever was running inside that frame. He filed it and kept moving. Prime watched him work. That was the word for it, work. This wasn't a hero performing combat. This wasn't the kind of fighting that came from training programs and simulated scenarios and the expectation that the system would produce backup. This was someone who had spent a very long time solving a problem that couldn't be solved the normal way, and had built a complete alternative methodology out of the pieces available. The quirk was clearly immense. The raw output of each strike, the distances covered in movement, the physical stress the body absorbed and continued operating through. But the quirk wasn't what Prime was looking at. He was looking at the decision-making. The way each move served 3 or 4 purposes simultaneously. The way the kid never took a position that he couldn't retreat from and never retreated without setting the next position. The way his eyes tracked not just Prime but the whole space, and the whole space included the hole in the corridor wall where the civilian access street ran 200 meters south. He was still thinking about them. Prime hit him again. Full connection this time, Izuku having exhausted the angle he'd been working, and not found a replacement in time, and watched him go through a stack of old framing material and bounce and come up bleeding from somewhere under the collar, still moving. There was something deeply irritating about it. Not the persistence. Prime had seen persistence before, had hit things that kept coming back and found it tedious rather than impressive. This was different. The persistence had a reason, and the reason was visible in every choice the kid made. He was still thinking about the civilians 200 meters south. Still thinking about whether Prime was going to turn back toward the residential zone. Still calculating the cost-benefit of every second he kept Prime's attention oriented this direction. He wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting to maintain an outcome. The distinction landed somewhere it shouldn't have. Izuku drove off the second rail line and came down at a steep angle, both fists loaded, and this time Prime moved into it rather than standing through it. Not a concession, more like adjusting for the geometry, and the contact point shifted from shoulder to forearm, and the force distributed differently. And for a fractional moment, the exchange was actually an exchange rather than a collision. Izuku felt it. He pressed. Prime let him press for exactly as long as it was useful, then ended it. One hand on the collar of the costume, momentum redirected, and Izuku went down into the corridor floor hard enough to crack the concrete under him. He lay there for 2 seconds, breathing. Then, "You're not going back south." It wasn't a question. Prime stood over him. "What makes you say that?" "You came north when I asked." Izuku got one arm under himself. "You've been keeping the engagement here." He pushed up to a knee. "You're not trying to hit the civilian zones. You haven't been since Camino." Prime looked at him. "You're not a disaster," Izuku said. The words were flat, just a red. "You're a verdict, and you're still deciding who it applies to." The silence that followed had a different texture than the silence before the fights. Prime wasn't positioning. He was listening. "You didn't panic when you saw what I could do," he said. "I panicked a little," Izuku said honestly. "But you came anyway. People were going to get hurt." He got to his feet. His ribs were doing something unpleasant. He noted it and set it aside. "That's not a complicated calculation," For you, it isn't. Prime's voice was level. Something in it had changed by a fraction. The flat certainty was still there, but there was something else underneath it now. The specific discomfort of encountering data that keeps not fitting. That's the problem. Izuku looked at him. Explain that. You're not what this world produced, Prime said. You're what it almost prevented. He held Izuku's gaze. You were born without a quirk. You were told explicitly by the systems in place that you couldn't be what you are, and then you became it anyway. His jaw set. That doesn't validate the system. That indicts it. Or, Izuku said, it means the people in it can do something better than the system deserves. That's a reason to protect them, Prime said. Not the machine built around them. I'm not protecting the machine. Izuku's voice was steady. I'm protecting the people, including the ones the machine is failing, especially those ones. Prime looked at him for a long moment. You know I'm right about what this world is, he said. About some of it. Izuku didn't drop his gaze. Not all of it. And being right about the broken parts doesn't give you the right to break the people living in them. The silence held. Then Prime moved. The last sequence was shorter. Izuku had been running on reserves for the last 4 minutes, and Prime knew it. The movement patterns had shifted the recovery time between contacts, lengthening the precision of the positioning, fraying at the edges where it had been crisp before. Not giving up. Running at actual capacity rather than calculated capacity, which meant the buffer was gone. Prime came straight no-angle play, and Izuku met him head-on because the corridor geometry didn't leave another option. The exchange lasted 3 seconds. Prime took 2 solid hits. The second one actually moved him a half step, which Izuku registered with the part of his brain that noted anomalies, and then it was over. The force that came back stripped Izuku off his feet and carried him through the air a long way. He hit the base of an old loading crane, and the crane registered the impact with a long groaning shudder before going still. Izuku didn't get up immediately. He was doing the math, the cost inventory, what was broken and what was only damaged, and what was damaged enough to matter, and the math was not good. He had function. He had movement. He had less of both than he'd had 10 minutes ago. He put his back against the crane base and looked at Prime across the corridor. Prime had stopped moving. He was standing in the center of the space, looking at Izuku with that same attention, the cataloging, the assessment, all of it, but there was something different in it now. Something that hadn't been there when the night started. You already know you're not done, Prime said. Izuku coughed, tested his ribs. Yeah. That's not a compliment. Didn't take it as one. Prime looked at him for another moment. Then he looked up and north toward where the city's emergency lights ran thickest, toward the Commission's coordination hub and everything the night still had left in it. You're not like the rest of this world, he said. I want you to understand that I mean that as a statement about the world, not about you. Izuku looked at him steadily. What does that mean? It means. Prime said that when this is finished, you'll understand why it had to happen. He turned north, and you'll have to decide what to build in the space where the old structure was. He rose off the corridor floor. Izuku watched him go. His breathing labored the crane cold and solid against his back. Around him, the industrial corridor was quiet, broken concrete and open sky, and the distant sound of the city continuing its long process of failing and holding on at the same time. He pulled out his comm. The channel was cleaner now. The shock layer had passed, and the coordination traffic was back to professional register the way it always came back once people remembered their jobs. He listened for 30 seconds, Then he pushed himself off the crane base, tested his legs, found them functional, if not happy about it, and looked north at the glow of the emergency lights. He followed. At 3:41 a.m., the Hero Public Safety Commission's primary operations center was running on 18% of its normal coordination capacity, and doing so with the specific competence of an institution that had been preparing for catastrophic degradation for the last 6 months. Director Okonkwo had not slept. She didn't intend to. The wall display showed 17 active incident vectors across Greater Tokyo, 11 evacuation corridors in various states of completion, 3 structural collapses under hero response, 2 Tartarus fugitive clusters still unaccounted for, and 1 tracking icon labeled Unknown Entity that had been moving in a slow, deliberate arc through the Northern Administrative District for the last 40 minutes. The arc had a shape to it. She'd been staring at the shape long enough that she understood what it was tracing. It was tracing her building. "Defense posture update," she said. The coordinator to her left, a woman named Sato, who had been in this room for 11 consecutive hours and showed it only in the precise economy of her movements, pulled up the current deployment overlay. Mirko confirmed on eastern approach. Edge shot holding west corridor. Kamui Woods has the main atrium. Gang Orca is staged at sub-level 2 with 4 support units. Civilian staff, 90% cleared. The remaining personnel are essential operations. I'm not clearing them until we lose the building. Okonkwo looked at the tracking icon. How long, Watson? Sato calculated without looking at the screen. 7 minutes at current velocity. Less if he decides to stop being patient. 7 minutes. Okonkwo thought about what 7 minutes meant in terms of what still needed to happen. 3 regional coordinators who still had direct lines to functioning hero teams and needed a full status transfer. Before those lines went through her building and died 4 encrypted data archives that needed off-site routing and 1 direct communication to the provisional authority structure they'd been quietly building for the last 2 weeks as a contingency for exactly this scenario. "Start the transfer sequence," she said. "Don't wait for my authorization on each step. Use your judgment." Sato was already typing. Prime descended through cloud cover at 3,000 meters and took stock. The commission building occupied a mid-sized footprint in the Northern Administrative District, 6 floors above ground, 3 below. The kind of construction that prioritized function over architecture, but had been reinforced after the Liberation War to meet the new load-bearing requirements of an institution that knew it was a target. The defensive posture around it was visible in the heat signatures and the comm traffic. 4 entry vectors covered sub-level approach, sealed roof access locked. Competent. He'd been watching the building's communications output since Kamino. What he'd assembled from it was not a tactical picture, it was a philosophical one. This was where rescue became resource allocation, where hero deployment became asset management, where the language of protecting people had been translated over decades into the language of managing systems, and the translation had been so complete that most of the people inside the building no longer noticed the gap between the two. That wasn't malice. That was the natural evolution of any structure given enough time and enough institutional pressure. The people inside were doing their jobs correctly. The jobs themselves were the problem. He stopped thinking about it and went straight down. Mirko hit him at 400 meters. She came off the eastern rooftop in a single launch, no announcement covering the vertical distance between them. In the time it took most people to register, she'd moved. Her kick connected with the side of his head with the kind of force that had caved in walls and stopped Nomu cold, delivered at the apex of her trajectory, no wasted motion. The specific brutality of someone who had spent years distilling violence down to its most efficient form. Prime's head moved 4 centimeters. He turned to look at her on her way down. She didn't waste time on reaction. She caught the building edge on the way past, redirected, came back up at a different angle with both legs loaded. The second kick struck his sternum. The third she aimed at his throat. He caught the fourth by the ankle, not aggressively, more like intercepting something in motion, and held her there for a moment. She looked at him from upside down, completely calm. "You punch back," she said. He set her down on the roof edge. "Not right now." She came at him again immediately. There was something in it that wasn't just combat reflexes. She was doing what she did, which was not thinking about systems or structures or the philosophy of institutional failure. She was thinking about the threat directly in front of her and responding to it with everything she had. No hesitation, no recalibration, no processing. Just full commitment to the action. Prime understood that. He even, on some level that he didn't examine too closely, respected it. He blocked her next 3 strikes, absorbed the 4th, and redirected her 5th into a controlled throw that put her 30 meters south and on her feet rather than her back. He was already moving before she landed, because the real approach he'd been waiting on was coming from below. Edge shot came through the western wall at sub-level speed, his body compressing to near 0 thickness to pass through the building's outer shell and reconstitute its striking distance. His first blade edge caught Prime across the forearm, the only hit in the entire night that had found a gap in the suit's coverage and drew a thin line of something dark before Prime's arm moved and closed the angle. Edge shot was already gone. Sub-level speed again threading through structural gaps, repositioning. He was the kind of fighter who didn't exist in one place long enough to be hit back. His entire methodology was built around denying his opponent a fixed target. Prime stopped moving entirely. He stood in the center of the commission building's outer plaza and waited. Edge shot completed 2 more transits through the east wall under the plaza surface, up through the decorative column to the north, and Prime tracked each one. Not visually. The way you tracked anything that moved fast through enclosed space, by reading the pressure differentials and the micro vibrations and the specific signature of something compressing and expanding. On Edge shot's 3rd transit, Prime reached into the column and stopped him mid-passage. Not crushing stopping. Edge shot reconstituted with Prime's hand around his arm. The 2 of them standing in the open plaza, and the expression on Edge shot's face was the expression of a professional who has just encountered the outer boundary of his own method. "Go," Prime said. Edge shot looked at him. "Take whoever's still in the building and go," Prime said. "I'm not here for the people." A long beat. Then, Edge shot moved, not retreating, transitioning already back through the wall to start the process of clearing remaining personnel. Kamui woods held the atrium. He'd spread his branches through every load-bearing junction in the structure, interlocking with the building's own framework to create a reinforced lattice that would require sustained force to break and would give him warning of every approach vector. It was excellent defensive architecture. He'd been building it for 4 minutes while the commission staff moved through evacuation lanes he'd pre-cleared. Sato passed him on her way to the sub-level exit. A physical drive in her hand and her face composed in the way faces got composed when composure was the only option available. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Kamui watched her go. Then the atrium ceiling came in. Prime descended through it without particular haste, and the lattice of branches that should have caught him bent and then snapped in a clean sequence, each joint giving way. In order from the point of contact outward, like a wave, breaking through a structure that had been built to absorb a different kind of force. Kamui felt each break up his arms, the quirk's feedback transmitting the load until the load exceeded what the quirk could carry. He pulled back before the cascade reached him, releasing the lattice and dropping to the atrium floor. The ceiling was open to the sky. Prime landed in the atrium, and looked at the space the evacuation lanes still being used, the last of the staff moving through the sub-level corridors, Kamui standing in the rubble of his own defensive structure. "The personnel are still moving," Kamui said. Not an accusation, a statement of fact directed at the situation. "I know," Prime said. He walked past Kamui toward the core of the building. Dund. Gang Orca held sub-level 2 with 4 support units and the specific patience of someone who had been waiting for a threat that hadn't come yet and was prepared to keep waiting until it did. The sub-level housed the primary server architecture for the Commission's regional coordination network, the actual infrastructure that connected hero agencies across 3 prefectures, managed resource allocation, and ran the communication trees that kept evacuation corridors from collapsing into each other. When Prime came through the ceiling of sub-level 2, Gang Orca's first strike was already in motion, a concentrated sonic pulse designed for enclosed spaces, calibrated to the dimensions of the room. Prime took it without flinching. The 4 support units engaged simultaneously restraint cables from 3 angles, a suppression field from the 4th. Prime moved through the cables and into the suppression field and continued. And the field's generators registered an input that was outside their designed parameters and shut down rather than overload. Gang Orca hit him twice with direct strikes, full strength, the mass of his body behind each one. The second one moved Prime a step. He noted the step, filed it, and looked at Gang Orca with something that was not dismissal. "You're protecting the servers?" Prime said. "Yes." "The servers run the coordination network?" "Yes." "The coordination network is what keeps the evacuation corridors from failing." Gang Orca said nothing. His posture didn't change. Prime looked at the server architecture. Thousands of active connections, the digital skeleton of an emergency response system, managing 231,000 people across the greater metropolitan area. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he stepped past Gang Orca to the central hub junction, not the servers, the junction that linked the Commission's authority architecture to the network. The administrative layer. The part that managed hero licensing, resource approval, deployment authorization, the chain of command that ran from Director Okonkwo down to every hero on every street in every sector. He put his hand through it. The servers kept running. The coordination network stayed up. The evacuation corridors held their data integrity. The comm channels between hero teams stayed live. What died was the authority structure. The layer that told heroes who had permission to do what and when and in which zone and under whose authorization. The system kept breathing. The chain of command stopped. On the street 4 blocks south, a hero coordinator named Tanaka listened to his earpiece go from organized traffic to something he'd never heard before. Not dead air, but a different kind of noise. Voices without hierarchy. Heroes calling in status updates that no one was routing. Requests for authorization that had nowhere to go. He stood on the corner and listened. And after 30 seconds, he made a decision that his training had not prepared him for. He started answering the requests himself. Not because he had the authority, because someone had to, and the thing that gave authority had just stopped. 3 blocks away, 2 hero teams that had been waiting for zone reclassification to begin a rescue operation looked at each other for 5 seconds after the silence started. Then they started the rescue operation.
Baturo.
Prime came out of the commission building through the east face, walking, not flying. Behind him, the structure was still standing. He hadn't brought it down. He'd gone through it with the precision of a surgeon removing something specific. And what he'd removed was the part that made it a command center rather than a building. Mirko was waiting on the eastern approach. She was bleeding from a cut above her eye from one of her own redirects. She watched him come out of the building. "What did you do?" she said. "Remove the jurisdiction layer." He paused. The network is still running. The people you're evacuating still have data coverage. She stared at him. The heroes on the ground still have each other, he said. They don't have the approval process anymore. That's not... She stopped. They're already working without it, Prime said. They were working around it before I got here. The only thing I removed was the delay. He looked at the city. The emergency lights were still running their patterns across the grid. The evacuation corridors were still moving. But the quality of the comm traffic had changed. The authorization requests had dropped out of it, and what remained was operational. Direct. Heroes talking to heroes about the work without waiting for a node to validate the conversation. He didn't say what he was thinking. He didn't need to. He turned north toward the dense center of the city, toward the part of the grid where the emergency lights clustered most heavily, where the power vacuum he'd just created was already drawing other forces toward it. He could feel it not physically, but as a pattern in the traffic, a shift in the underground channels that had gone quiet when the Commission's coordination machine was running loud and were now beginning to move. Something patient, something that had been waiting for exactly this kind of space. He filed it. He'd deal with it when it surfaced. Behind him in the ruins of the Commission building's atrium, Mirko stood in the dark and listened to the city reorganize itself without permission for the first time in a very long time. 40 kilometers west. In a location that appeared on no Commission registry, a screen displaying the Commission's network traffic showed the authority layer go dark. The man watching the screen said nothing. He had been saying nothing for hours. He had a very good reason to say nothing. His physical condition was such that speech was an expenditure he measured carefully, and he had been watching this particular sequence of events with the patience of someone who had planned around multiple outcomes and was now observing which one had arrived. He touched a control. The screen shifted to show a map of the greater Tokyo area, with the Commission's authority architecture removed, leaving only the raw network connections between hero teams and the population centers they were managing. He looked at the gaps. There were many gaps. He touched another control, and in 3 locations across the city, things that had been waiting for exactly this began to move. The first sign was the triage stations. 3 of them in districts. The Commission had already cleared small operations, quiet setup in structures that wouldn't draw attention. Medical personnel with credentials that didn't quite check out against any active registry. Supply caches moving through evacuation corridors at hours when the hero teams had rotated off. The kind of logistical activity that looked from any single angle like relief work. Prime picked it up in the comm traffic at 4:20 a.m. Not the operations themselves, the gaps around them. The way certain frequencies went clean in sectors where the hero coverage had thinned. The way some requests for resources were getting answered faster than the official channels could explain. Someone was moving into the spaces the Commission had left behind. He'd seen this kind of infrastructure before, the kind built not to replace an existing system, but to occupy its collapse. It didn't need to be large. It just needed to be ready and positioned and patient. And this one had been all 3 for a long time. He changed direction and went looking. The first thread led him to a distribution point in the Kiyashi district, a former logistics warehouse, running a Tartarus escapee relocation operation that was on examination considerably more organized than the stated purpose required. 3 exits, secure underground staging comm equipment that wasn't emergency-banned civilian gear. 2 men inside who moved like people accustomed to violence rather than people accustomed to relief work. He went through the wall at ground level. The 2 men made the professional decision very quickly. The equipment in the room survived longer than they expected to, before Prime located the relay node embedded in the subfloor and pulled it out. The node was broadcasting to 6 other locations, He followed two of them. The second site was a containment facility for what the intake logs called displaced quirk users requiring stabilization, a phrase that described in practice a holding operation for people whose quirks had been cataloged and were being assessed for extraction potential. The people doing the assessing weren't medical staff. Prime put the assessing team through the eastern wall. He found the intake logs and looked at them long enough to understand the scope: 43 intake records in the last 18 hours. All in districts where the Commission's coordination had gone dark. He destroyed the logs, opened the containment doors, and moved on. The third site connected to the fourth and fifth, which connected to a deeper node that wasn't in any of the buildings he'd already cleared. It was underground, 2 levels below a decommissioned manufacturing plant in the outer ring, accessible through an entrance that was from above, indistinguishable from storm drainage infrastructure. He went in. The space below was large. Not dramatically large, not the kind of villain base that announced itself through scale. Functional large. The kind of space that had been built over many years by someone who understood that the most durable infrastructure was the kind that didn't look like infrastructure. Corridors branching at logical intervals, each one serving a distinct purpose. A medical wing, a research section, a containment area for things that had once been people, before someone had decided the people were less interesting than the applications. High-end Nomu, staged in cells. 12 of them in varying states of completion, some dormant, and some cycling through the low-level activity patterns that passed for awareness in their modified state. Prime looked at them through the cell walls. He understood what they were. He'd pieced together enough from the hero comm traffic to know that these were human beings, subjected to a process that had been designed to extract the parts someone found useful and discard the continuity that had held those parts together. The result was power, without person capability, without anyone inhabiting it. He recognized the philosophy. Not the technique, the philosophy. The thing that said people were resources before they were people. He opened the cells, not to release the Nomu. They were too damaged for that to be a kindness. He opened the cells because what he wanted was on the other side of the containment section, and going through the cells was faster than going around. The Nomu stirred as he passed through some of them, tracking movement with what remained of their sensory processing, and he moved through their reach without incident, because nothing in this facility had been built to stop something like him. The man at the end of the facility was waiting. He was seated not because he was relaxed, but because his physical condition imposed a cost on standing that he'd long since stopped pretending it didn't. The life support apparatus around him was functional rather than medical, the kind of engineering that maintained a body at operational capacity without concerning itself with comfort. He was very tall, even seated. His face showed the accumulated damage of a very long history, and above the apparatus, his eyes were clear and fully attentive. He had been listening to Prime move through his facility since the third corridor. He'd run the assessment during that time and arrived at several conclusions, the most important of which was that the options available to him were considerably narrower than they'd been 2 hours ago. "You move efficiently," he said. Prime stood at the far end of the room. He looked at the man, and then at the room, the screen showing the city's current state, the now dark commission network overlay, the 3 active feeds from his remaining operational sites. He took it in without hurry. "You've been waiting for something like this," Prime said. It wasn't an accusation, just a read. "I've been preparing for a great many contingencies," the man said. "This particular sequence wasn't in my models." "No, it wouldn't be." Prime's gaze came back to him. "How long have you had the infrastructure positioned?" "The outer ring sites, 3 years. The deeper nodes, considerably longer." A pause. You're not here because I'm a threat to you. No. Then you're here because of what I represent. The man's voice was measured, the kind of measure that had been practiced to the point where it occurred without effort. You've removed the hero licensing apparatus. You've created a vacuum. I was filling it efficiently and with considerably less chaos than the alternative. You were filling it, Prime said, with the same thing you always fill things with. The man waited. Ownership, Prime said. The Hero Society took people and built a brand around them. You take people and absorb them. Different method. The same base assumption that people are more useful as components than as themselves. The room was quiet for a moment. You're describing a simplification, the man said. I'm describing what I saw in your intake logs. Prime took one step forward, and the step was not aggressive. It was the step of someone closing distance, because the distance had served its purpose and was no longer necessary. The Commission put heroes in uniform and called it protection. You put people in cells and called it stabilization. You've been doing it longer and you're better at hiding it, but you don't actually disagree with the model. You just want to run it. The man's expression didn't change. He had very good control of his expression. You're angry, he said, because the world failed to live up to something. I'm not angry, Prime said. And it was true his voice carried none of the heat that the word implied. What it carried was something colder and more deliberate. I'm finished. The man looked at him carefully. You're going to destroy this facility. Yes. The Nomu in the containment section represent years of... I know what they represent. A beat. Then you understand, the man said, shifting his approach, that what you're doing tonight doesn't end with the hero licensing structure. The space that creates will be filled. The question is by what? I know. And you're not going to stay to manage the answer. No, Prime said. That's not what I'm here for. The man studied him for a long moment. Whatever calculation he was running, it was thorough. He was too careful to rush it. Finally, something behind his eyes settled into a conclusion. You're not a force of change, the man said. You're a force of negation. Yes, Prime said. He said it without apology, without hesitation, without the defensiveness of someone who'd been told something they were uncertain about. Just acknowledgement, flat and complete. Then we have nothing further to discuss. No. Good night. What followed was not a conversation. The man had prepared for threats of considerable magnitude. The facility's deeper systems activated as a Prime crossed the threshold of the main room. And what they produced was not a single overwhelming response, but a layered sequence. The kind of defense built by someone who understood that any single countermeasure could be defeated and had instead designed a system that traded each layer for time. The Nomu from the containment section arrived first, the active ones, the ones that retained enough processing to respond to emergency protocols. 4 of them combat configured moving with the particular momentum of creatures that had no capacity for hesitation, because hesitation had been removed along with most of what had once made them people. Prime put 2 of them through the eastern wall, redirected a third into the 4th, and moved through the space they'd occupied. The next layer was environmental atmosphere modification. A dense interference field meant to disrupt energy-based attacks by flooding the medium they traveled through with competing frequencies. Against a quirk user, it would have created significant problems. Against Prime, it was an inconvenience he walked through, while the generators running the field registered inputs they hadn't been calibrated for and failed in sequence. The third layer was the man himself. He stood the apparatus, supporting the cost of it, and what he brought to the exchange was not the single devastating quirk of something that had decided to commit fully to destruction. It was a constellation of accumulated capability. each component serving a different function, the whole thing managed with the discipline of someone who had spent decades learning how to apply force economically. He was very dangerous. He was also not fast enough. The first exchange went to him. Prime took 2 hits that would have ended most encounters, absorbed them, recalibrated. The second exchange was even. The third Prime controlled, and after the third, the pattern was clear. The man understood patterns. "You've done this before," he said. They were in what remained of the research section, the walls between them and the corridor having been redistributed during the preceding 30 seconds. "Many times," Prime said. "Different world. Different worlds." The man filed that. His operational capacity was reduced. Prime had targeted the apparatus during the second exchange, not to destroy it, but to degrade it, and the degradation was showing. You travel between them. I fell into this one, and your assessment of this one is that it needs to be stripped of what's false, Prime said. He hit the man hard enough to move him 3 meters across the room through a workbench into the far wall. "Not you, not the heroes. The structures both of you built on top of the people who are actually worth something." The man lay against the far wall. His apparatus was running emergency protocols. He was calculating remaining options and finding the inventory shorter than he preferred. "You'll leave a vacuum," he said. "I know." Prime stood over him. "Something will grow in it. Whether it's better or worse than what existed before, that's not my question to answer." "Whose question is it?" Prime looked at him for a moment. "The ones who are left," he said. He brought the ceiling down on the research section, not the whole facility, not the containment corridors where the no-mu were not the access tunnels the remaining staff had used to clear out during the first 2 minutes of the engagement. Just the center, the heart of it. The part that had been doing the work of turning people into assets for 3 decades. The man survived. Prime had positioned the collapse to ensure it. He would be extracted by whatever was left of his organization, and whatever came next for him would be smaller and slower and more constrained than what had come before. That was sufficient. Prime came out of the facility through the surface entrance and stood in the pre-dawn dark of the outer manufacturing ring. The city to the north was different than it had been 4 hours ago. The Commission's coordination architecture was gone. The underlying villain organization that had been waiting to fill the vacuum was broken and leaderless, and currently in the process of discovering that the man who had been managing it from the center was no longer in a position to manage anything. 2 of the major power structures that had defined the shape of this world for a generation were now fractured or absent. What remained were the people. The evacuation corridors still moving under the coordination of heroes who had stopped waiting for authorization and started using their judgment. The civilian populations in the shelters and the triage stations and the half-collapsed districts still alive, still requiring protection, still the actual content of the world that both the hero society and its opposition had claimed to be about. And UA, which Prime could see on the city's emergency lighting grid, a cluster of signal density in the southeastern district that indicated concentration. People moving toward it, resources being directed at it, heroes and civilians, and everyone left. Converging on the one remaining structure that was large enough and defended enough and still coherent enough to function as a center. He had known this was coming. The city's population didn't choose their convergence points consciously. They chose them by following the paths of least fear. And right now, the path of least fear led to the one place that still had walls and people inside who were still trying. He looked at the signal cluster for a long time. Then he began moving southeast. They came on foot mostly. The roads into the UA district had been cleared of vehicles since Midnight Commission Protocol, one of the last orders to go through before the authorization chain went dark. So the people arriving came, the way people always came when systems failed them, in groups carrying what they could, following whoever seemed to know where they were going. By 5 a.m., the UA grounds held 11,240 people who were not students or staff. Midnight had been 8,000. The number kept growing. Aizawa stood at the main gate and watched the count update on the screen. A first-year support student was running from a tablet she'd been operating continuously for 4 hours. The student's name was Tomoko. She was 17. She had a spreadsheet open that tracked intake by family unit medical need and available shelter space, and she was updating it with the systematic efficiency of someone who had decided the most useful thing she could do in a crisis was make the crisis legible. "We're at 91% on the Western dormitory," she said without looking up. "I can fit maybe 300 more in the training halls if we pull the equipment." "Pull it," Aizawa said. "The gym annex is... pull everything." He looked down the road. More people coming, moving through the pale pre-dawn. Some of them with bags and some without, and some carrying children who had fallen asleep despite everything. "Every square meter we have." She was already typing. Typed. Izuku found the medical station in what had been the third-floor classroom of Building B. Recovery girl had been evacuated 2 days ago, her age and condition, but her equipment was there, and 3 support heroes who'd come in from the Saitama incident were running the space with the focused competence of people who'd stopped sleeping and hadn't noticed yet. His ribs were the main issue. 3 of them had been telling him things he didn't want to hear since the industrial corridor. The support hero who assessed him, a compact woman whose quirk involved accelerated cell knitting, told him he had 2 fractures and 1 full break, and that she could get him to 60% function in about 40 minutes. "I need 80, he said. 60 is what I can safely do without putting you out for 6 hours. 60, he said. And then, thank you. She started working. He lay on the cot and looked at the ceiling and listened to the building around him. The sounds of 11,000 people redistributing themselves through a campus that had been built for 500. Footsteps, low voices, the occasional sound of something heavy being moved. Somewhere 2 floors below, a child was crying in the intermittent way children cried when they were too tired to maintain it continuously. He thought about what Prime had said in the industrial corridor. When this is finished, you'll understand why it had to happen. And you'll have to decide what to build in the space where the old structure was. He didn't know what to build. He didn't think Prime was right that everything had to come down for something better to go up. But he also knew that he'd been walking through a version of the world he thought he understood for months, and the version he'd seen tonight through Prime's actions was one he hadn't let himself look at directly. He stopped thinking about it. His ribs needed the energy. Scott, in the command area, which was the teacher's lounge, repurposed the coffee machine pushed against the wall to make room for 4 screens showing whatever feeds were still live. Present Mike was handling comms, while Midnight and Cementos managed the internal routing, and 13 ran the shelter allocation math. Aizawa moved between them, not directing so much as arbitrating the moments when 2 systems needed to agree. Shoto came in at 5:15. He'd been on the east perimeter for 2 hours, not because anyone had assigned him there, but because he'd looked at the defensive map when he arrived, identified the least covered approach vector, and gone to cover it. He had a bruise along his left jaw from something that had happened before he reached UA that he hadn't explained and no one had pressed him on. "The eastern barrier is undersupported," he said. "We have 3 second-year students and 1 injured pro on the outer ring between markers 7 and 11. That's 400 meters of approach on a slight elevation advantage for anyone coming from the industrial district." Aizawa looked at the map. Recommendation: redistribute 2 of the current west perimeter units. That approach is more heavily covered than the threat profile justifies given current intel. "Do it," Aizawa said. Shoto went to implement it himself. Midnight watched him go. He's been running the perimeter defense like he built it. He did build part of it, Aizawa said. He turned back to the screens. Bakugo found Izuku in the medical station at 5:30, which was 20 minutes earlier than the support hero had expected to release him. He stood in the doorway and looked at Izuku sitting on the edge of the cot, testing his range of motion, making the face he made when things hurt more than he wanted to admit. "You look terrible," Bakugo said. "I know." "How bad?" "2 fractures, 1 break, about 60%. Izuku looked at him. Bakugo had a bandage around his left hand that hadn't been there yesterday and wasn't new enough to be from tonight. "You. Fine." Izuku didn't argue. He knew what fine meant from Bakugo, which was functional and not interested in discussing the inventory. "He's coming here," Izuku said. "I know. You've seen the numbers. What he did to Endeavor, to Commission, to... I know what he did." Bakugo stepped into the room. His voice had none of the volume it usually carried, which was its own kind of signal. "I also know he's walking toward 11,000 civilians and a bunch of people who can't fight back. So we're going to be between him and them." He stopped next to the cot. "That's it. That's the whole plan." "Bakugo, I'm not asking you if it's a good idea, Deku. I'm telling you what I'm doing. You can come or you can sit here counting your cracked ribs." He turned toward the door. "But you're going to come." Izuku looked at him for a moment. "Yeah," he said. He stood up. "And the part of the UA..." The grounds nearest the outer barrier was a wide apron of hardscape, the area where public events had been held. When public events were still something that happened, the kind of space that felt different at 5 in the morning, when the bleachers were taken up by sleeping families, and the grounds crew students were running power cables for the emergency lights that had replaced the usual campus lighting. A group of children had gathered near the eastern bleachers, not sleeping, watching Shoto work the barrier controls 30 meters away. One of them, a girl of maybe 8, with a hero-branded blanket that had seen better days, pointed at him and said something to the older woman beside her. The older woman looked up at Shoto, then at the eastern perimeter, then back at the girl. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's one of them." The girl looked at Shoto for a long moment, with the particular seriousness of a child who was processing something that didn't fit the categories adults had given her. Then she asked the question that all of them were asking in the different ways available to their ages and their vocabularies. "Is he going to be enough?" The older woman didn't answer. 2 meters away, Shoto finished the barrier calibration and moved to the next section. He'd heard the question. He didn't have an answer either. He kept working. At 5:47, the first sensor array on the northern approach registered a contact. The alert moved through the UA comms in about 4 seconds, passing from the sensor station to the perimeter coordinators, to the command area, to every earpiece on active duty. In the teacher's lounge, Aizawa looked at the tracking display. The contact was moving from the northwest. Steady pace, not rushing. Altitude approximately 30 meters, dropping slowly as it approached. "All units to position," Aizawa said. His voice was even. "Non-combat personnel to interior shelter sectors. Anyone not in a support role off the outer grounds now." The campus began to move. It moved with the kind of organized urgency that looked from the outside like controlled panic people flowing through the corridors and access paths they'd been walked through twice already tonight. For exactly this scenario, the support students with their tablets directing traffic at every junction, the pro-heroes and advanced students moving outward while civilians moved inward, the two flows threading through each other in the practiced way of people who'd rehearsed it. Tomoko stood at her station near the main gate and kept her tablet running, updating the shelter count as the last exterior civilians came through. She'd been doing this for 5 hours. She was going to keep doing it until there was nothing left to count. The contact was 4 kilometers out. 3. On the northern parapet, which was the roof of the main academic building, accessible by a stairwell that Ida had been managing with his usual geometric efficiency for the last hour, 7 students stood at the outer edge and watched the northwest sky. The sun was starting. Not visible yet, but the darkness had thinned from black to the particular deep blue that came just before color. And in that light, the figure approaching from the northwest was a shadow against a slightly lighter shadow, moving at a height that put it level with the building's upper floors. Izuku stood at the center of the line. On his left, Bakugo gauntlets active the faint smell of nitroglycerin already in the air around his palms. On his right, Shoto the temperature around his right side, a degree or two colder than the ambient, the steady readiness of someone who had been holding this particular kind of tension for years and had learned to exist inside it. Behind them, Tokoyami with dark shadow cycling through low-light calibrations. Kirishima hardened to combat grade. Momo, who had spent the last 2 hours producing equipment she was distributing through the perimeter lines. Uraraka, who had been making sure every non-combatant on the roof level was off it. 2 kilometers. 1. The sky had them all. Izuku watched the figure close the distance and thought about the industrial corridor, about the conversation that had ended with him sitting against a crane base and Prime rising away from him into the night. About the sentence that had come last, the ones who are left. He said the decision would be ours, Izuku said. Not to anyone specifically, just to the air, the way you said something when you needed to hear it out loud to know if it was true. Bakugo didn't look away from the sky. Then we'd better make one. 500 meters. The barrier held. The lights held. The 11,000 people inside the walls held in the particular way of people who had stopped having anywhere else to go and had decided with the pragmatic clarity of exhaustion to trust the one standing between them and the outside. On the parapet, nobody moved. 200 meters. The shadow resolved into a shape, and the shape was a young man in a dark suit with an insignia on the chest that none of them had seen before tonight, descending toward UA at the pace of something that had already decided where it was going and saw no reason to hurry. He stopped 50 meters out, held altitude. Looked at the wall, the barrier, the students on the parapet, the lights of 11,000 lives behind them. He looked at all of it the way he'd looked at the convoy on the Camino Road, with the careful attention of someone taking a final inventory before making an irreversible decision. Then he looked at Izuku. Izuku looked back. The sky held the color just before dawn. Not light yet, not dark anymore. The city behind Prime was broken and lit with emergency signals and still moving, still alive, still full of people doing the work of being human in the middle of a disaster. The city behind Izuku was 11,000 people breathing. Last chance, Bakugo said very quietly to no one. The barrier held. The barrier lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Shoto had calculated 6. The discrepancy came from the third impact he'd modeled Prime decelerating before contact, which was what anything rational would do when approaching a hardened surface at that angle. Prime did not decelerate. The outer ring shattered inward on the western face. The force wave that followed knocked 17 people off their feet in the civilian staging area, 60 meters behind the breakpoint, and Uraraka had 3 seconds of warning from the tremor to get her quirk on the largest debris fragments before they became the leading edge of a casualty event. She got most of them. Western outer down. Ida's voice in the earpiece, already moving his legs, a blue-white blur as he rerouted the western evacuation column away from the breach, rerouting civilian traffic to sectors D and E. I need someone on the D junction in 30 seconds. On it, Momo said. She was already producing traffic guides from her arm, simple physical, the kind of equipment that worked when nothing electronic did, distributing them to the 3 second years she'd positioned at the junction an hour ago. Prime came through the gap without pausing and took the first defensive line at altitude, which was the wrong altitude for the configuration Shoto had set up. The ice formation caught him at knee level instead of center mass and shattered instead of binding. Shoto rebuilt immediately. Lower this time, denser, bridging 2 structural columns to create a weight-bearing obstruction rather than a cage. Prime went through it at walking pace, the ice crunching under his feet, and Shoto felt each impact through the ground and recalibrated again. 3 seconds per structure. He had about 12 left in him before the output cost started compressing his reaction time. He used them well. The problem with the third line was Bakugo. Not in the sense of something going wrong, in the sense that Bakugo had been assigned the third line, which was the direct contact intercept position, and when Prime came off Shoto's 4th ice construct and turned toward the center of the grounds, Bakugo was already there. He'd been watching the approach pattern. "You're going straight through," he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't addressed to anyone. Prime looked at him across 30 meters of broken courtyard. "Every time," Bakugo said, "every single time it's the same thing. Someone shows up who thinks they're the only one who actually understands what's wrong with the world." His gauntlets were cycling the smell of sweat and nitroglycerin sharp in the pre-dawn air. "You know what I've noticed? Those people always end up deciding the solution is to break everything in reach." Prime said nothing. He started walking forward. "I'm not moving," Bakugo said. "I know," Prime said. The distance closed and Bakugo detonated not a single focused blast, but a sequenced series, each one aimed at a slightly different point in Prime's trajectory, forcing redirects, burning lateral movement, denying the straight-through path. The explosions were loud enough to register in the civilian shelters 2 buildings over. One of them caught Prime's shoulder at an angle that actually moved him 6 inches sideways. 6 inches, Bakugo pressed. He'd seen the angle that worked and he went back to it, driving harder, closing ground while Prime recalibrated. The third detonation landed cleaner than either of the first 2, and for a moment, the momentum was wrong. Prime's forward progress stopped. His weight shifted back, and Bakugo was already in the air for the follow-through. Prime's hand caught him mid-flight. Not in the chest. Not the kind of strike that ended engagements. The kind of catch that said, "I know what you're doing, and I'm done letting you do it." He set Bakugo down on the courtyard surface with the specific deliberateness of someone who had decided to be careful. "You're real," Prime said. The same words he'd said to Endeavor, carrying the same weight and the same additional layer that made them worse rather than better. "That's not going to change what happens." Bakugo looked up at him from one knee. Gauntlet still active, the left one cracked across the release valve from the impact. His breathing was hard. His eyes were not. "Then, I'll get up again," he said. Prime looked at him for 1 second. Then he moved forward. Bakugo got up again. He was on the 4th line by the time Prime reached it. Cut through a support corridor came out ahead, which was either extraordinarily fast thinking or had been planned before the engagement started, and neither option surprised anyone who knew him. He didn't lead with explosions this time. He led with his body, driving into Prime's path at an angle that didn't accomplish anything direct, but pulled Prime's attention northeast for 3 seconds, while Tokoyami's dark shadow came from the west. Dark shadow hit like a physical object and wrapped. Not restraint disruption, forcing Prime's arms and compressing movement options, giving Mirio the opening he'd been holding for 40 seconds. Mirio phased through the ground, came up directly underneath, and drove both fists upward at the base of Prime's stance. The impact translated wrong. Prime's mass didn't distribute the way a human mass would, but the disruption worked. Prime went lateral instead of forward, and that lateral movement took him away from the main evacuation corridor for the 4 seconds it took Ida to clear the last cluster of civilians from the path. 4 seconds. Ida covered 400 meters in them. He came back to the line after. "Clear," he said into the comm. Then, because he was Ida, "Northeast Corridor Section F is now free. I'll reposition to the southern junction. Someone needs to cover the connection between the main building and the annex." "On it," said Momo's voice, already half-finished producing what she needed. Prime assessed. Not a pause, a continuous process running underneath the physical engagement, the way a current ran under surface water. He'd been doing it since the barrier broke. The students were working in a way that was hard to disrupt because it wasn't built around any single point. There was no commander to remove. There was no central position to break. The whole defensive pattern was distributed, each person making local decisions that connected to adjacent decisions without needing coordination from above. It was the kind of fighting that emerged from a group that had trained together long enough to internalize each other's tendencies and trust them. He'd broken the commission. He'd broken the authority layer. He was walking through a generation of fighters who'd never needed those things to function in the first place. He filed that. It didn't change what he was here for, but it was a different category of obstacle than he'd encountered earlier in the night. He put Tokoyami's next strike into the eastern wall and moved through the spray. On the interior line, the last defensive position before the main building's ground floor Izuku was not where Bakugo had told him to be. He was 30 meters further out, positioned at the connection point between the academic wing and the emergency shelter intake, doing the thing he'd been doing since Kamino, making himself the most efficient use of his own body in the current situation. What the current situation required was someone at the intake junction who could make fast decisions about evacuation routing. When the battle line stopped being stable, which they had stopped being 3 minutes ago, he'd already rerouted 4 groups. The third reroute had required him to carry an elderly man with a compromised knee through a section of corridor that had partially collapsed. One of Shoto's ice structures had sheared off the outer support when Prime went through it, and the debris had blocked the primary path. He was coming back from that when he heard the sound. A different quality to the impacts, heavier, lower, the kind of resonance that came from something hitting structure rather than other combatants. He knew what it meant. Prime had shifted targeting. He changed direction and ran. The main building's western facade took the first direct strike and gave approximately as well as a reinforced educational structure could give, which was better than expected and still not enough. The second floor lost its outer wall across a 40-meter section. The third floor held. In the shelter on the first floor, a room containing 212 civilians registered the impact as a full body jolt that knocked stacked supply containers off shelves, blew out the 2 east-facing windows, and silenced every conversation in the space simultaneously. A child in the second row. The girl from the eastern bleachers, the one with the hero blanket, grabbed the arm of the woman next to her and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling held. 6 meters above them, 3 second-year students who had been assigned to structural monitoring were already calling the damage into the comm, calibrating which sections needed immediate support and which were stable, doing the work of keeping a building standing while someone outside was working to make it fall. One of them, a boy who was 16 and had a quirk that let him feel stress loads in solid materials, pressed his hands to the floor and listed the fracture vectors in the eastern support. In a voice that was deliberately professionally flat, because the information was only useful if it got transmitted correctly. The woman on the shelter floor heard his voice through the wall and held the girl tighter. Shoto rebuilt for the 7th time. The ice was thinner than it had been an hour ago, Not dangerously so, but visibly so. The edges rougher, the formation, time a fraction longer than it should have been. He'd been aware of the cost curve since the third structure. He'd been managing against it. Prime came through the seventh formation, and Shoto was already pulling back to the inner defensive ring when Prime stopped. He'd stopped because Izuku was there, not positioned. Just there, having come out of the academic wing from the side. Arriving at the same point in the courtyard, at the same moment Prime cleared the seventh structure. Which was either coincidence or the product of Izuku's continuous recalculation of where he needed to be. The two of them occupied the same courtyard for 3 seconds without either moving. Shoto slowed his withdrawal. He didn't stop. Izuku looked at Prime. Prime looked back. "The third floor shelter," Izuku said. "You hit the western face." The structural load was acceptable. "There are people in there." "I know." Prime's voice was flat. "They're not my target."
Cyberman.
"What is—" Prime looked at the academic wing behind Izuku. The building that had been a school longer than most of the people in it had been alive, that had produced every generation of heroes since the licensing system began. That had been turned in the last 6 hours into the last place in the city, where something called a future was still being stored. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Izuku stepped forward. He didn't attack. Not yet, not from this angle, with his ribs still registering objections and his body running at a fraction of what it had been in the industrial corridor. He stepped forward because the alternative was to step back, and he'd run out of directions that weren't backwards. "The people in this building didn't design the system you're breaking," he said. "I know. The students didn't. The families in the shelter didn't. The kid in the room behind you who's 16 and trying to hold a ceiling up with his hands didn't." Prime looked at him. "They're living inside what the system created," Izuku continued. "That's the only place any of us can live. Inside what already exists, trying to make it work, trying to do something real, inside a structure that isn't always real." His voice was level, not steady, which would have implied the absence of effort, but level, which implied the presence of it. "You took apart the commission. You took apart All for One. You've been taking apart everything that was wrong with this world tonight." He held Prime's gaze. "What's left is the people." The courtyard was very quiet for a moment. Then from somewhere behind Izuku Bakugo's voice, not a shout, just a declaration, the kind that didn't require volume because it wasn't asking for anything. "We're still here." A beat. Then Shoto's voice, same register, "Still here." Ida from the junction 40 meters east. "Still here." Uraraka from somewhere above and to the left, managing a falling section of the second floor's outer wall. "Still here." One by one from the broken courtyard and the damaged corridors and the 2 lines that were still standing between Prime and the main building's interior, the voices came through. "Still here. Still here. Still here." Not defiance, not a battle cry. Just a fact stated as plainly as facts. Gots is stated by people who were reporting their status to each other as much as they were saying anything to Prime. Prime stood in the courtyard and listened to all of them. His expression didn't change. But something in the stillness around him did a fraction of shift in the weight of the moment, the way air changed when a decision was being made inside it. Then he hit the academic wing. The strike landed at the building's foundation junction, the structural node where the academic wing connected to the administrative block, a deliberate choice that maximized the destabilizing effect while minimizing the direct casualty exposure. The building didn't fall. It cracked. The outer wall of the academic wing separated from the administrative block across the full vertical extent. And the sound of it was the sound of something that had stood for a long time, being told it would not stand forever. dust came down in the courtyard. From inside the shelter, the sound of 212 people holding their breath. The ceiling held. Izuku was back on his feet a second after the impact knocked him down. His left arm wasn't reporting in the way it should have been, but he was standing, and standing was the part that mattered right now. The academic wing was still standing. Damaged, cracked along the foundation joint, the outer wall gapped from the administrative block, but standing. Prime looked at it. Then he rose above the courtyard, above the roofline, and looked at the full scope of UA. Below him, the damaged outer barrier, the broken lines of ice and debris marking the path he'd taken through the defensive layers, the lights still on in the shelter sections, the students and heroes still in their positions, still doing the work of being between the people inside and the outside. The sun was coming, not risen yet, but present the horizon, pale and definite in the east, the first light catching the smoke that had been rising from various parts of the city for hours and turning it from dark to gold. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked down at the courtyard, at Izuku standing in the dust with one arm not working properly, and the full complement of UA's remaining defenders arranged in the broken perimeter behind him. "You held," Prime said. "Yes," Izuku said. "Not the building, not the line." Prime's voice held something that wasn't approval and wasn't quite its opposite. "You held what you were trying to hold." The courtyard was quiet. Prime descended back to ground level. The gates were open. The outer defenses were broken. The academic wing was cracked from foundation to roofline. UA was still standing in the way that mattered, not structurally intact, but inhabited, occupied by people who had not left. That was the state of things when the mass engagement ended and the narrower, harder accounting began. The comms went quiet at some point. Izuku didn't notice exactly when it was gradual, the same way sound in a room faded when everyone present understood that talking had stopped being useful. The coordination traffic dropped to operational minimums. The evacuation updates became shorter. The voices that had been threading through his earpiece for the last 5 hours reduced themselves to the bare facts of ongoing work. He pulled the earpiece out and set it on a piece of broken masonry at the edge of the courtyard. Behind him, the academic wing leaked dust from the foundation crack. The eastern evacuation corridors were clear. Uraraka was managing the last shelter transfer. Ida had the external perimeter. Shoto was sitting against the administrative block wall, his output exhausted down to a slow fog of cold around his hands, watching. Bakugo was watching too from the far end of the courtyard. His left gauntlet was held together with tape from the emergency kit on his belt. He didn't say anything when Izuku removed the earpiece. He understood what it meant. Izuku turned back to face Prime. They were 20 meters apart. The sun had risen enough to turn the dust in the air golden, not light yet, not full dawn, but the kind of pale, diffuse brightness that preceded it. The courtyard looked smaller in it. The damage looked older, the way ruins always looked once they stopped being in the process of becoming ruins. Prime was watching him with the attention that Izuku had come to recognize as more than assessment. It was the gaze of someone for whom this particular problem had been running as a background process since the industrial corridor and had now come to the foreground. "You're not going to ask for time," Prime said. "No. You know what the outcome is." "I know what the probable outcome is," Izuku said. "That's not the same thing." He rolled his left shoulder once, testing it. It reported back with limited information. He noted the limitation and moved on. "I also know that the last time I fought you, you didn't break anything. You didn't have to. I was making a point. You're still making it." Izuku looked at him steadily. "The question is whether this conversation is still happening, or whether it ended when you hit the building." Prime was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to say?" he asked. not conceding, genuinely asking. "I want to know if you're finished," Izuku said. "Not with fighting, with deciding." He watched Prime's face. "Because everything you've done tonight reads like someone executing a verdict they've already written. And I want to know if the writing is actually done, or if there's still a line being weighed." The courtyard was very quiet. "Why does it matter to you?" "Because if there's a line still being weighed," Izuku said, "then this is a conversation. And if it's a conversation, then what I say has some meaning." He paused. "And if it doesn't, then I'm going to fight you anyway, and what I say won't matter, but I'll have said it." Prime looked at him for a long moment. "Say it," he said. "Tinked." Izuku took a breath. "You're right about a lot of it," he said. "The commission, the licensing, the way the system turned protection into a jurisdiction. The way All Might got packaged into a product. The way heroes stopped being people who did something and became symbols that existed to make everyone feel better about the machine." He held Prime's gaze. "You're not wrong about those things. I've been living in the middle of them. I've felt the places where it breaks." Prime said nothing. "But here's what you're missing," Izuku continued. "You're treating the broken structure and the people inside it as the same thing. Like the failure of the framework is the failure of every person who tried to do something real inside it." He took one step forward. "That 16-year-old in the shelter who was holding up the ceiling with his hands tonight, he didn't design the commission. He didn't write the licensing laws. He found a quirk he had and decided to use it to keep a ceiling from killing people. Another step. That's not a system. That's a person. And you don't get to erase the difference." "I haven't killed anyone," Prime said. "You've been killing something," Izuku said. "Every time you break a thing that people were holding on to. Every time you prove that the strongest person in the room gets to define what's real and what isn't." His voice stayed level, not calm-controlled. "That's the thing you're actually teaching tonight. That might make verdict. And that's the version of heroism I've been trying not to become my whole life." The air between them held for 2 seconds. Then Prime said, "You were told you couldn't be a hero. You were told the world had decided for you. You spent years proving the decision wrong." His voice was flat. "How is that different from what I'm doing?" Izuku felt the question land. He'd expected it in some form since the industrial corridor. "Because I was trying to get in," he said. "You're trying to tear it down." He stopped walking. They were 12 meters apart. "There's a difference between refusing to accept the world's verdict on you and deciding you get to issue verdicts on the world." Prime was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had something in it that hadn't been there at the beginning of the night. Not softer, but different. Heavier the way things got heavier when they were being carried at the end of a long distance rather than the beginning. "You're the most honest thing I've seen in this world," he said. "You and the old man. And what I'm about to do to you is the truest thing I can say about where that leads." He looked at Izuku with the expression of a person who has arrived at a conclusion that gives them no pleasure. Real people in wrong structures don't fix the structures. They get used by them until there's nothing left. "I'm not your enemy. I'm the proof of where the road you're on ends." Or, Izuku said, "You're a person who decided to stop believing in the road and started burning it, and you're calling that wisdom." Prime looked at him. "I'm going to hit you now," he said. "And I want you to understand that I'm not doing it because I don't see you. I'm doing it because I do." "I know," Izuku said. He activated One for All and closed the distance. Deku. The first exchange lasted 8 seconds and left 3 parallel trenches in the courtyard floor from redirected force. Izuku fought the way he always fought, when the power gap was wrong, not trying to match output, trying to manage geometry. He was never in the same place twice if he could avoid it. He angled strikes to force lateral adjustments rather than absorb straight-line returns. He used the broken architecture of the courtyard, the rubble and the fractured flagstones, and the remnants of Shoto's ice structures to redirect and re-establish without giving Prime a static target. It worked well enough to work. Prime caught him on the fourth exchange when Izuku used a wall fragment as a launch point, and the fragment gave way half a beat earlier than his weight calculation had assumed. The catch was by the forearm, and the throw was controlled not full velocity directed, and Izuku hit the ground 30 meters away, having experienced both the impact and the very specific sensation of having one's body inform them that the left arm was no longer a reliable variable. He got up. He didn't feel the arm. He noted that he didn't feel it and cataloged the implication and filed it for later, because later was a thing that required surviving the present, and surviving the present required moving. He came at a different angle, lower, favoring the right, using the outer edge of the courtyard to constrain Prime's lateral options. The second sequence ran longer. Prime adjusting to the new geometry, Izuku pressing the constraint, both of them working at a pace that was fast enough to make individual moments blur into a continuous stream of force and response and recalibration. In the adjusted geometry, Izuku found an angle that worked. It worked once. He drove the strike into Prime's side with everything his right arm and whatever remained of One For All's output could generate, and for a moment the force was enough. Prime's weight shifted his trajectory, bent 1 foot leaving the ground. Prime looked at him. "Good," he said. Not praise, just acknowledgement. Then he hit back. The blow landed across Izuku's chest, and the chest's opinion on the matter was comprehensive and unanimous. He was in the air for what felt like a long time. The academic wing's remains were below him, and then beside him. And then he was in the interior of something that had once been a corridor, and the corridor's floor was very present and very hard. He lay there. From outside, through the gap his passage had made, he could see a slice of courtyard and sky. Dawn, actual dawn. The first real gold of it, cutting across the broken roofline of UA and turning everything it touched into something that looked like it should be an ending. His right arm was shaking. His ribs had long since moved past the language of individual complaint into a general position statement. The left arm remained silent. He pressed his right hand flat against the corridor floor. He had a number for how many times he'd gotten up past the point where getting up should have been possible, accumulated across every fight he had ever been in, where the only forward was through something he wasn't strong enough to push through. He'd stopped counting at some point. The counting was beside the point. The point was the floor under his hand and the wall to brace against, and the next breath after this one. He pushed himself to one knee. Behind him, through the gap, he heard Bakugo say something very short in a voice that was absolutely flat. The specific flatness of someone choosing not to say what they were actually feeling. Because what they were actually feeling was not useful right now. He got to his feet. He came back out through the gap. Prime was 3 meters from the entrance, waiting, which meant he'd followed the arc and tracked the landing and positioned himself for the return. He'd known Izuku would come back. That was either a compliment or an inevitability. And at this point, the distinction was academic. Izuku looked at him across 3 meters of broken ground. His body was running an inventory that he was choosing not to read in detail. He had function. He had less of it than he'd had 20 minutes ago, and considerably less than he'd had at the beginning of the night. He had One For All at a fraction of what he could usually access, the quirk responding to the cumulative damage the way a fire responded to running low on fuel still burning, doing less. He had exactly one thing that had not changed since the convoy rode at Camino. "You said I'd understand why it had to happen," he said. "When it was finished?" "Yes." "I don't." He looked at Prime, not defiant, honest. "I understand why you think it had to. I understand what you saw in this world that made you decide. I even think some of what you saw was real." He steadied his breathing. "But I don't understand how breaking it teaches anyone anything, except that the strongest person wins. And I've spent my entire life trying to build something different from that." Prime looked at him for a long moment. "That's why you're the most dangerous thing in this world," Prime said. "Not your power, not your will." He stepped forward. "Because you actually mean it. And when someone actually means it, it makes everything else look like what it is." "Then don't break it," Izuku said. "That's not how this works." "I know," Izuku said. "I know it's not. I just needed to say it." He activated what remained and went at him one more time. The final exchange was short. Not because Izuku stopped trying. He tried with everything that remained the full focus of a mind that had spent its entire existence learning to find edges and apply force at angles and refuse to concede ground that didn't need to be conceded. He found 2 more moments in the sequence where the geometry was right. He used both of them, both connected. Prime let them land and kept coming. The last strike was the same quality as the one that had ended their first engagement in the industrial corridor, calibrated, deliberate, the kind that communicated a decision rather than expressed a feeling. Izuku went down into the foundation of the academic wing's inner courtyard, and the flagstones around him registered the impact in a ring of displaced stone. He did not get up. He was conscious. His body had simply completed its accounting and arrived at the number 0. And the number 0 meant that the next motion available to him was something other than standing. He lay on the broken flagstones and looked up at the pale dawn sky. Prime stood at the edge of the impact point and looked down at him. "You understand now," Prime said, "that this isn't personal." "I know," Izuku said. His voice came out smaller than he intended, the body's cost showing in the things it had to manage to produce speech. "I know it's not personal. That's what makes it so hard to argue with." Prime was quiet. "The people in that shelter," Izuku continued. The ceiling above them was gone open sky from the academic wing break, the whole inner courtyard exposed to the morning. "The families, the students, the ones who didn't make any of the decisions you've been taking apart tonight," he breathed. "They're still there. They're still the thing that everything else should have been about." "Yes," Prime said. The word came out with a weight that it hadn't carried earlier in the night. "Then leave them something," Izuku said. "Whatever you're going to do next, leave them something to build from." Prime looked at him. The silence lasted long enough that Bakugo, at the far end of the courtyard, took a step forward before stopping himself. Prime crouched down to Izuku's level, not threatening, not close, just reducing the vertical distance enough that what came next was between 2 people rather than 1 person and a downed opponent. "You haven't understood yet," he said quietly. "What I'm leaving is the question. Whether they use it depends on them." He paused. "On people like you, when you're back on your feet." Izuku looked at him. "How do you know I'll get back on my feet?" "Because you got up every other time," Prime said. "And you're still thinking about the families in the shelter." He stood. "That's not someone who stays down." He turned and looked at what was left of UA in the early morning light. The fractured outer line, the broken administrative block wall. The academic wing cracked from base to roof, and inside it all the people. Still there, still breathing. Still the content of the world he'd spent the night making a judgment about. He looked at it for a long time. From the far end of the courtyard, Shoto watched. His hands had stopped producing cold an hour ago. He was sitting against the wall because sitting was what his legs were currently willing to negotiate. He watched Prime look at UA, and he thought about the 7 ice structures he'd built, and the way each one had come apart, and the 16-year-old in the shelter who had been holding the ceiling. He thought about his father's face when Endeavor had climbed out of the building, 3 ribs fractured, and the hell flame running low, and said, "Get All Might." He thought about All Might. He thought about what came after nights like this, not in combat terms, but in the longer arithmetic of what was possible and who was left to attempt it. He didn't come to any conclusions. He wasn't sure conclusions were available yet. Izuku was lying in the center of the inner courtyard in a ring of displaced flagstones. And Bakugo was crossing the courtyard toward him now with the specific directness of someone who was done waiting for an acceptable moment to move. And the dawn was coming up gold and certain over the broken roofline of Ua Prime rose off the ground. He looked southeast, where the city's emergency lights still patterned the grid in the way of ongoing human effort rescue and triage, and the slow, messy work of people trying to put something livable back together out of what the night had left them. Then he turned his gaze up to the higher altitude where the clouds caught the first real light of the day. He looked like he was trying to decide something. The decision, whatever it was, didn't resolve into any visible action. He was simply there, suspended above UA in the early morning present, in the way that very powerful things were present. Without announcement, without requirement, taking up the space they occupied, as a matter of fact. Below him, Bakugo reached Izuku and crouched down without a word. He put one hand on Izuku's shoulder, not to help him up, just to be there. The contact was brief and entirely lacking in sentiment, and it said everything it needed to say. Izuku's hand found the broken flagstone beside him. He pressed down. He wasn't going to get up right now. The math was still wrong by a significant margin, but the pressing was the beginning of it. The dust settled slowly. It always did after something large enough to displace that much air. The particles caught the morning light on their way down, turning the space above the inner courtyard into something almost gentle, pale gold, and drifting the kind of light that didn't know what it was, illuminating. Izuku lay in the center of it and breathed. The breathing was the full extent of what was available to him right now. His body had completed its assessment and arrived at a verdict not 0, but close enough that the difference was academic. His right arm worked. His left arm had opinions but could be persuaded. His legs were a longer negotiation. He turned his head and saw the academic wing, the crack running its full height, the gap where the eastern wall had separated the second floor with half its facing gone. He saw Bakugo sitting 3 meters away on a piece of collapsed railing, not looking at him, looking north toward where Prime had been the last time either of them had tracked him. He saw Shoto back against the administrative block wall, frost on his palms from the cold. His body was shedding, even without output, watching. He saw further back in the shelter entrance of the main building the faces of people who had come to the doorway because the sounds had changed. An older woman with a blanket around her shoulders. A man with 2 children pressed against his sides. The girl from the eastern bleachers, the one with the hero blanket. Her face turned toward the courtyard with the expression of someone who had been told something very large and was working out what category to put it in. He heard the comm traffic in the earpiece he'd set down on the masonry, thin now. Disorganized voices asking for information that wasn't coming back. The coordination layer was gone. What remained was people trying to reach other people across a city that had lost its nervous system. He pressed his right hand into the flagstone and worked on the negotiation with his legs. Marmot, Prime was 400 meters north, standing on the roof of the administrative tower that served as the last functioning coordination relay in the southeastern district. He wasn't using the relay. He was standing on it because it was the highest point in the area, and the view from it was comprehensive, and he was taking stock of what the night had produced. The city spread out in every direction. The emergency lighting grid ran active across approximately 60% of its coverage area. The rest dark, either from Prime's actions or from the cumulative load of a city operating past its infrastructure limits for too long. The evacuation corridors were moving slower now, less coordinated, the heroes on them working from their own judgment rather than dispatched instructions. The shelter population was holding. The casualty reports coming through the fragmentary comms were bad, but not catastrophic. The city was damaged. It was not destroyed. He'd known this was the probable outcome. Destruction had never been the point. He'd come here to prove something, and the proof was complete. The hero licensing apparatus was gone. The authority chain that had been telling people who was allowed to protect other people was gone. The underground network that had been preparing to exploit the vacuum was broken and without direction. The generation that had been trained as the next iteration of the hero system had been tested against the outer edge of what their world could produce and found to be genuinely capable and genuinely insufficient, which were two different things and both true. What remained was the question he'd left behind in every place like this one. He looked southeast toward UA for a long moment. Then he looked at the coordination relay beneath his feet. The last one, the one still sending data to the hero teams, working the evacuation corridors, and did nothing to it. He left it running. The last action happened in the city center at the building that housed the hero billboard chart, the public ranking system that had been the face of hero society for the public. The thing that turned protection into performance metrics and made heroes into comparable products. It had survived the night. It sat intact in the middle of everything. Still lit, the screens running their automated cycle even with no staff present to manage them, because the cycle was hardwired to continue until manually interrupted. Prime landed in front of it in the early morning in the pale gold light and looked at the screens. The ranking system showed its current state, most of the top slots marked with status indicators that ranged from injured to status unknown, to the small gray icon that meant the system hadn't received a check-in and had defaulted to the last recorded state. It was a ledger of the night's damage expressed in the language the system understood. Rank scores, response times, approval ratings. It was still trying to make sense of the night in those terms. He put his hand through the central display housing, not through the building, through the component that ran the ranking and broadcast functions. The structural systems, the power grid connection to the emergency shelter 3 blocks east, the data lines running to the hero team, coordination nodes, those he left intact. He took the numbers. The screen went dark. The building stood. He stepped back and looked at the dark facade for a moment. "You built a machine that turned rescue into a leaderboard," he said. He wasn't speaking to anyone present. His head was tilted at an angle that wasn't quite toward the street or the building, or the sky, slightly off from all of them, as if addressing something in the space between. "And you called it heroism." His voice carried the particular flatness of someone arriving at the end of a very long thought. "The machine is gone. What happens with what's left is the question you should have been asking from the beginning." He looked at the dark screen for one more moment. Then he was gone, rising off the street in the morning light, carrying no announcement of direction. In the main shelter of Ua Toshinori was seated against the wall in the corridor outside the medical area. He was conscious. The injuries from the rooftop engagement had been stabilized by the support hero who had also worked on Izuku, and stabilized was doing a lot of work. As a word, he was upright. He could see, he could hear the comm traffic leaking from the earpiece in someone's pocket down the hall, and that was the current extent of the positive news. He had been in this corridor for 2 hours. He had listened to the assault happen outside the sounds of it, the layered noise of a campus under siege, and been unable to move toward it, which was a kind of experience he was still learning to inhabit. The inability to act. The particular weight of being the person who would once have been the answer to this problem, and no longer being that person. He heard the silence change when Prime left UA. He heard the silence change again sometime later, when the hero billboard went dark, not directly but through the ripple it created in the comm traffic. Voices that had been using the ranking system as a reference point for resource allocation, suddenly improvising new references, finding language for things the ranking system had been the approved language for. He sat in the corridor and listened to the city learn to speak without that particular vocabulary. One of the support students came around the corner, the one with the spreadsheet, Tomoko, moving at a pace that suggested she was going somewhere with purpose. She stopped when she saw him. "Sir?" She held her tablet to her chest. "The billboard system went offline." "I know. The hero teams in the field are improvising coordination. It's working mostly. Slower." She hesitated. "I've been trying to find a protocol for reporting status without the ranking system." "There isn't one," Toshinori said. She absorbed that. "So we make one." He looked at her. She was 17. She had been awake for at least 6 hours. Her spreadsheet had 231 entries in the first column and was currently running to a much larger number than that. "Yes," he said. "We make one." She nodded, already turning back toward the intake station, already composing the new protocol. In the part of her mind that worked on those things continuously, she disappeared around the corner. Toshinori leaned his head back against the wall. He thought about a boy who had once cried in an empty stadium because the world had told him the only thing he wanted to do with his life was impossible, and whom he had told otherwise. He thought about what that boy had done with the thing he'd been told. He thought about what Prime had said on the rooftop. The structure finds them and puts them in uniform and builds a brand around them, and he thought about whether the brand had ever been the point or whether the point had always been the people who wore it and what they chose to do before the brand arrived. He didn't have an answer that satisfied him. He had the distinct sense that the not having an answer was important, and that the people who were going to have to live in the question were currently in the inner courtyard and the shelter corridors, and the half-collapsed administrative wing doing the work of getting through the morning. Izuku got to his feet at 6:47 a.m. Not because the math had resolved in his favor, it hadn't, not by any reasonable calculation. He got up because the corridor behind him had 2 people in it who needed to get to the medical station and couldn't navigate the debris field without someone to walk them through it. And because his legs, it turned out, were willing to negotiate on those terms, he walked them through. He came back out into the inner courtyard afterward and stood in the morning light. The dust had settled. The crack in the academic wing was very clear in the daylight, the separation between the wing and the administrative block visible along the full vertical extent. The courtyard was scattered with the evidence of the night-broken flagstone. Shoto's ice remnants, the blast patterns from Bakugo's detonations, still dark against the lighter stone. Bakugo was standing at the far edge, arms crossed, looking north toward the city. Izuku walked over. They stood together for a while without speaking. The city was audible from here, the distant operational sounds of a metropolitan area doing the difficult work of surviving a disaster. Emergency vehicles, construction equipment, the low constant hum of infrastructure under strain. Voices, many of them carrying the particular register of people who were handling things because things needed handling. "He left," Bakugo said. "Yeah. Just left." "Yeah." Bakugo was quiet for a moment. What was the point then? Izuku considered the question. He'd been considering it since the industrial corridor in various forms, and he had more material to work with now. I think, he said slowly, that was the point. That he could. He looked at the crack in the academic wing. That the whole thing, the commission, the licensing, the ranking system, all of it could be taken apart by one person in one night, and none of the defenses built to protect it were actually protecting what it said it was protecting. He paused. And now we have to figure out what to do with that. Bakugo's jaw moved. He was either chewing on the analysis or on something else. That's not a satisfying answer, he said. No. He's gone and the question is still here. Yeah. Izuku looked at the courtyard, at the evidence of the night arranged across the broken flagstones. I think that was the plan. Bakugo exhaled hard through his nose. It was the sound he made when he was filing something away rather than resolving it. People are still going to need saving. Yeah, Izuku said. The evacuation corridors aren't going to route themselves. No. And someone's going to have to build whatever comes after the commission. Izuku looked at him. Bakugo was still looking north, his profile sharp against the morning sky, the cracked gauntlet on his left hand catching the light. Yeah, Izuku said. Bakugo pushed off the edge he'd been leaning on and turned back toward the shelter entrance without a word. He was already reading the first problem that needed solving in the next hour, cataloging it, moving toward it. That was what Bakugo did. With things that couldn't be resolved, he went to the next thing that could be. Izuku stood at the edge of the courtyard for a moment longer. He looked at the city, the lights and the smoke, and the ongoing difficult work of it, the thing that had been happening before Prime arrived and continued now that Prime had gone. He thought about what Prime had said in this very courtyard standing over him. What I'm leaving is the question. Whether they use it depends on them. He thought about Tomoko with her spreadsheet. He thought about the 16-year-old with his hands on the ceiling. He thought about the woman on the shelter floor who had pulled the child closer. He thought about Endeavor climbing out of a building with 3 cracked ribs looking at the sky where Prime had gone and saying, get All Might not, because All Might could fix anything, but because there were still things that required being witnessed by someone who had given everything they had to them. He thought about All Might in a stadium 11 years ago saying, you can become a hero. He looked at the crack in the academic wing. Then he turned and walked toward the shelter entrance, toward the next problem that could be approached, because that was what was available, and he had never once in his life found a way to do anything other than begin from what was available. Behind him, the inner courtyard held its morning light. The flagstones held their cracks. The academic wing held its separation. The gap between the wing and the administrative block, clear and permanent against the pale sky. The city held its noise. It was not the noise of a world that had been given an answer. It was the noise of a world that had been handed a question and was figuring out what to do with it. That was the state of things when the morning continued.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.